all across Europe that falls short of what we would consider war, but is also very, very dangerous. So Phil's going to join us, and we're going to kind of think through what we're actually seeing out of Russia, and then how we understand that and how the international community should respond to that. We're also going to talk a little bit about what's going on with Trump and sort of this imperialism discussion, talking about the Panama Canal and Greenland and Canada and what might be behind this, and what we should make of a incoming president talking in ways that we haven't really seen since the 19th century in terms of sort of American imperialism. So that's sort of what we've got lined up today. I think it's going to be a really, really interesting show, and I'm super excited about talking with all of you about it. All right, so on Monday's show, I talked about Elon Musk and the troubling influence that I believe he's having or exerting over the U.S. political system. The other issue that I've been thinking about lately, and has really been sort of on my mind, is the broad normalization of Trump that we've been witnessing since the election. Politicians, the media, corporation, billionaires, all engaging in a version of bending the knee to the incoming president. Now, during the campaign, there was attention paid to the multitude of ways in which Trump was a danger, like the way he was a threat to democracy, an authoritarian, or you even had people talking and using the language fascist. We were having those important conversations. Now, you may argue that there wasn't enough attention paid to that, and I would tend to agree with you. But at least there was a conversation about the nature of the threat that Trump posed. And it strikes me that those conversations have largely disappeared, except for on places like WCPT, where we can still have those conversations. But at a macro level, the amount of attention being paid to Trump's erratic, dangerous, unhinged actions seems to have dramatically lessened. I've heard it described as sane washing. And this is an absolutely brilliant term, sane washing. So I looked it up to give you a formal definition. Sane washing is the act of minimizing the perceived radical aspects of a person or idea in order to make them appear more acceptable to a wider audience. And this term is so powerful, and I think it absolutely describes what we've been witnessing in our political system since the election, sane washing. It strikes me that as a whole, we are seeing the culmination of a long-standing effort to normalize Trump. We are minimizing the radical aspects of Trump in order to make them appear more acceptable to a wider audience. I think we could call it the great normalization of Trump. And this is playing out in a variety of really important ways. And I'll touch on those in a moment. But for me, this was particularly evident in the Christmas message or messages that Trump posted on social media. And it really stood out when you look at the stark contrast of the tone of the Christmas messages shared by Joe Biden and Donald Trump, the outgoing and incoming presidents. And as a political scientist, I like to think about patterns and comparisons. And wow, did this offer a really, really interesting one. So let's start with Biden. And I want us to think about the language being used by both Biden and Trump. For Biden's Christmas message, he narrated a video tour of the White House Christmas decorations. And in that, he urges America to, quote, set aside all the noise and everything that divides us. He goes on to say, we're here on this earth to care for one another, to love one another. He went on to say, too often we see each other as enemies, not as neighbors, not as fellow Americans. Biden urged Americans to find a moment of quiet reflection, to remind themselves to treat each other with dignity and respect, to live in the light, and remember that there was more that unites us than divides Americans. He went on to say, we're truly blessed to live in this nation. He said, that's powerful. I mean, and so as I was thinking about the message, it struck me as powerful and touching. By contrast, Trump published a lengthy Merry Christmas message. Actually, he had a whole bunch of messaging on Christmas. And in that, he wished a Merry Christmas to the radical left lunatics who are constantly trying to obstruct our court systems and elections. But I want to read you part of his Christmas post. And so this is the actual post itself. And again, think about the language and the contrast that we're seeing here. Merry Christmas to all, Trump said, including the wonderful soldiers of China who are lovingly but illegally operating the Panama Canal. He goes on to talk about the United States lost 38,000 people in the building of the Panama Canal, which is not accurate at all. He says also to Governor Justin Trudeau of Canada, whose citizens' taxes are far too high. But if Canada was to become our 51st state, their taxes would be cut by more than 60%. Their businesses would immediately double in size, and they would be militarily protected like no other country in or in the world. Likewise, to the people of Greenland, which is needed by the United States for national security purposes, and who want the U.S. to be there, and we will. Now let's remember for a second, this was Trump's Christmas message. He also called on Canada to recruit hockey great Wayne Gretzky to run for Prime Minister of Canada, which he notes will soon to be known as the Governor of Canada. And so over and over and over again, he's referring to Canada and the Prime Minister as the Governor. So let's think about how not normal all of this is. It's widely inaccurate what he was saying there. It's disinformation at its absolute best. China is not operating the Panama Canal. Trump claims that we, the United States, lost 38,000 people building the canal. That's absolutely not accurate. In fact, I spent some time this afternoon researching that because, like I'm sure many of you, when Trump says something, he says it with such clarity that we assume, well, is he right? The number who died building the canal is thought to be around 6,000 individuals, but there were only 3,000 American deaths, or I'm sorry, 300 American deaths. So Trump says we lost 38,000 people, and there were only 300 American deaths. Then there's the claim that the U.S. needs Greenland for national security purposes, and that the people of Greenland want to be here and want the United States control. That the United States will somehow take over Greenland. And again, the idea that Canada will become the 51st state. You know, this is it's really sort of stunning stuff. The New York Times had a really interesting article where they presented some other messages, Christmas messages from people like FDR and Nixon and Michelle Obama. And one thing we see over and over again is all of those messages, whether they're from Democrats or Republicans, are consistent in the language of unity. I mean, think about the message that I read you from Joe Biden. That's the kind of thing that we've historically seen from presidents. And then Donald Trump comes along and does all of this dangerous, unhinged behavior. It's not normal. But how have we responded? As I think about how the media and the others, we've said, well, this is sort of Trump. Trump is being Trump. I think that's really, really dangerous, and I think it's sort of a great normalization of Trump. So let's take a little break. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I think this is so dangerous, and then we'll start getting to some calls. So we'll be right back on WCPT.
If Cage Walls Could Talk with Jody Whittaker.
Captain Paul Watson is a marine wildlife conservation and environmental activist.
And as his head rose out of the sea and his eye was there right before me, so close I could see my own reflection in that eye. That whale understood what we were trying to do because I could see the effort he made to pull himself back. And instead of crashing forward, he began to slide back to the sea as I disappeared beneath the surface, and he died. He could have killed us and chose not to. So I owe my life to that whale.
If Cage Walls Could Talk, Saturdays at 5.
Two-time Emmy and Grammy Award winner Kathy Griffin.
I'm here.
My life on the PTS D-list.
Well, you freed Britney.
New Year's Eve, December 31st at the Chicago Theater.
But you didn't have a plan.
On sale now at Ticketmaster.com.
Well done. Well done.
Spend New Year's Eve with Kathy Griffin at the Chicago Theater.
You're listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We've been talking a little bit about what I'm calling the great normalization of Donald Trump, sane washing of Donald Trump. But before we get back to that, let's open those phone lines and we can talk about anything that is on your mind. Trump, Elon Musk, the Panama Canal, Greenland, Biden commuting the sentences of 37 of the 40 prisoners on death row. There's also a story out of Arkansas where a federal judge has overturned a 2023 Arkansas law that would have threatened imprisonment for librarians or booksellers. So I think that's a really, really interesting topic if people want to talk about that. It is likely to be appealed, so it doesn't mean this goes away. We could also talk about Bill Clinton's recent comment on whether the country was ready for a female president. Bill Clinton said yes, but he thought that it was likely that the first female president would be a conservative. So if that's something that you're curious of talking about, feel free to call the number. Again, the number is 773-763-9278. And if you don't normally call into the show, or maybe you're a first-time caller, I encourage you to pick up that phone. I love to hear from all of you. So if you've got something on your mind and you don't normally call into the show, please absolutely do so. All right, so while you're putting your thoughts together, let's get back to what we were talking about before the break, the great normalization of Trump. I highlighted his Christmas post before the break, but I think it goes much deeper. We're seeing this play out across the media, corporations, politicians, even in our government institutions. And on some level, I understand why. Why are we normalizing Trump? At a psychological level or a human level, we have to, right? Human beings can't live in a stage of emergency indefinitely. Our nervous systems can't handle it. We're wired to make the abnormal normal. But I think we have to be aware of what's actually going on here. I mean, let's just think about some of the examples of this great normalization. I'm guessing, like many of you were deeply troubled by ABC News settling this lawsuit with Trump. The Disney-owned ABC News media agreed to pay $15 million to settle a lawsuit Trump filed against the network. The former and future president claimed that he had been defamed when ABC's George Stephanopoulos described Trump as liable for rape. And we could get into the details of that, but I think the big picture is that many people feel that ABC was actually in a really strong legal position here. Yet they caved, and they paid the president. They settled with the president to the tune of $15 million. It's a big thing, right? So when our media is now being intimidated by the incoming president, I think that has a chilling effect. So as we think about the ways in which we are normalizing Trump, and all of us, and specifically ABC News here, I think this is really, really dangerous. And let's take another example, not ABC News. ABC News has they have deep pockets. They have lots of money they can throw around. But the Des Moines Register does not. After the ABC News settlement, Trump came out and is targeting other media outlets. Was it last week or so, we learned that Donald Trump is suing Ann Seltzer and her polling firm at the Des Moines Register. Now, they do not have the same sort of deep pockets, accusing them of fraud. Now, basically what Trump is doing is saying he didn't like the poll that Ann Seltzer did. Right before the election, she came out, and this is, she's well respected as a pollster, and came out and she had Kamala Harris up 3 points. And so we think about this, like Trump is going after one of the most respected pollsters, going after a relatively small paper, and suing her for election interference. These are really troubling developments. And so when we think about the way in which this normalization of Trump is having a chilling effect. This last week, there was a story about the Los Angeles Times owner who's declared war on his own staff, and he's spiking opinion pieces critical of Trump. And according to recent reporting, has instituted a new policy that prohibits editorials containing criticism of the president-elect unless they are presented side by side with another opinion piece representing the opposing view. And he also has announced a plan to post a bias meter on all opinion pieces or opinion content for the LA Times. Again, that's stunning. We think about newspapers. They should have the right to take editorial positions. And why is the LA Times doing this now? I think largely because they're afraid of Donald Trump. We could also talk about, and we're talking about the great normalization, all of the big tech individuals, whether it's Apple or, Tim Cook or Zuckerberg or all these other individuals, Bezos, who've gone down to Mar-a-Lago, have met with Donald Trump. Bezos is donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration. Right? We're thinking about all of these dynamics as they're playing out and pushing the democracy in a way that I think is not productive. Bezos has also announced that the Prime Video will live stream Trump's inauguration. I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but let's think about all of this in the context of the great normalization of Donald Trump and the abnormal behavior, which is suddenly seen as normal. I was also really troubled by Christopher Wray and the FBI. And I think we can throw this decision for him to step down as also part of this sane washing and great normalization. The FBI director is appointed for 10-year terms. Yet Wray is stepping down early because he knows that Trump wants to fire him and replace him with Kash Patel. But once again, this is normalizing the abnormal. It's not okay to fire the FBI director or threaten to fire the FBI director. And I would have hoped that Christopher Wray would have said, if we're going to break these norms, if we're going to behave in ways that are so abnormal, we should force Donald Trump to do those. And I think what Christopher Wray was doing was, at a human level, I can understand. He's saying, well, this guy's going to fire me. It's probably not good for the FBI. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to step down and allow and protect the FBI. But I think the net effect of that is once again normalizing what is really, really abnormal behavior. And so I'm very troubled by what we've seen since the election in terms of legitimizing, sane washing, and turning Donald Trump into a normal political actor when he absolutely is not. So I see we've got some calls coming in. People want to talk about this. Remember, the phone number is 773-763-9278. If you've got something on your mind and you want to talk about it, please give us a call or give us a text. Let's start with Jim. Jim from Chicago, who wants to talk about dictatorship. Hey, Jim, good to chat with you, and welcome back to WCPT.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, dictator, that's a trait of a normal trait of a dictator to expand their territory, regardless of who's on the acreage. Or who's going to suffer? They want to expand it. You see the Chinese president wants to take back Taiwan. You see Putin wants to take whatever portion of Europe he can possibly grab before he hits the graveyard. And Trump on the same thing. I don't know if this is part of Project 2025. I wish he would have mentioned when he talked in that debate about eating cats and dogs. He said, well, I intend on taking back the Panama Canal and Greenland and Canada. I wish he would have said that in the debate. I don't know if somebody's tweeted in his ear that these are good ideas. Or what?
This is a really important point, because there's part of me that wants to know who is it that is whispering in Trump's ear to say, hey, bring up the Panama Canal. Hey, let's talk about Greenland. Is this something that he's held for a long period of time? Is it some extremist? Because, like you said, they're so bizarre. And to circle back to your first point, they're bad for democracy. Like, the more that we legitimize, the more that we normalize this kind of behavior, that means it's going to be easier for Trump moving forward, especially as we think about the way in which the media may be, giving into Donald Trump. So I think you're absolutely right. These can be very, very dangerous dynamics.
Yeah, and Professor, another incredible thing is the Supreme Court picking that particular month to give him carte blanche. But you saw the three justices that deferred. Yeah. You're making him a king. You're making the man a king, a dictator. No, and he's so both. He's abused our court systems to the point where I don't know how they can even talk about crime and punishment or civil law when he's broken every law in the country, and he's talking about political actors who interfered in the election of 2020. He's all over the country. Right. He sent people all over the country to interfere in it.
Well, in this,
go ahead.
No. I think you're absolutely right. This immunity decision is one that is I think fueling Trump right now, because he knows that accountability is going to be nearly impossible. And this is something that again, when that case was working its way through the court system and going through the lower courts and the appellate courts, and nobody really thought that Trump was going to get, or I should say, the presidency was going to get that level of immunity. And so when the Supreme Court offers that, it is, again, as a political scientist, I find it really, really dangerous, because it empowers the president to do so many things and makes it really, really difficult to hold them accountable for anything that they were to do that you could say falls within the constitutional responsibilities of a president. No, I think you're connecting the dots there is really important.
Yeah, but remember this. They were clairvoyant in this case. I don't recall the Supreme Court ever taking up that. In fact, they usually try to disassemble the power. They're not getting more power than the presidency, but they were almost clairvoyant in this case, knowing that I'm not saying, but it's almost they knew he was going to win the election. Because why would they do that? I don't even understand why they take that time. Anyway, Professor, have a great weekend. It's going to be a great show. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jim. No, absolutely. I think a couple thoughts that grow out of Jim's idea here is that I think the court at that point was probably thinking about the cases against Trump, thinking about the two federal cases and some of the other cases, but the ripple effect now that Trump is coming back into office is really, really stunning. I of all the Supreme Court decisions are, again, a lot of them are very, very important, but that immunity decision is one that is going to live with us for many, many, many years. It is going to have, again, a ripple effect for future presidents. And again, it is the Supreme Court normalizing what is not normal behavior. You know, the president shouldn't try to carry out an insurgency against its own democracy, right? The president shouldn't be taking documents to Mar-a-Lago. You know, all of these things, you should allow the court systems to hold the president accountable for that type of behavior. And again, I feel like prior to the election, we were having these real conversations. But now that we've drifted to Trump coming in as the incumbent president, we've sort of accepted him and say, well, I guess this is just the deal. And again, at a human and a psychological level, I understand him. We're overwhelmed with Trump, but it's really, really dangerous. And I think we have to find spaces to continue to have these conversations. All right, we gotta get to a break. But when we come back, we're going to take more of your calls. Again, if you want to chat, call 773-763-9278 on WCPT.
Hey Progressives, this is Richard Chu, host of Chu's Views here on WCPT AM 820, 6 to 8 a.m. Monday through Friday. We have some real challenges in front of us as a country. Since the beginning of this show, I have always felt compelled to bring you the best that I've got. Now, there's always a why to doing whatever we do. So, as we go forward and face these challenges, know this, you listeners are my why. Because I want to make sure I do everything I can to provide a safe, open, forward-moving space that allows you to call, email, text, or just listen to a guy that wants to help you bring out your own championship qualities to truly make this place better for us all. Lofty goal, idealistic, maybe so. But that's my why, and I look forward to bringing you the best that I've got. This is Richard Chu. Stay tuned.
Clean up the new year with help from Menards. We carry all the Libman products you need to keep your house clean. From brooms and mops to cloths and liquid cleaners, we've got you covered. The Libman 14-inch angle broom is precisely cut to reach under cabinets and into tight corners. Pick one up today, plus check out our weekly flyer on Menards.com for all the great deals happening now.
Save big money at Menards.
Make this season even brighter by lighting up every drive with the unrivaled performance of a new Porsche from the Porsche Exchange in Highland Park. Stop in today to test drive the latest models, including a new 2025 Porsche Cayenne. And right now, lease a new 2025 Macan Electric for $999 a month for 39 months. Visit the Porsche Exchange in Highland Park or PorscheExchange.com. 8,609 due with signing. Excludes tax, title, license, and dock fee. No security deposit required. Expires 1/2/25.
You're listening to WCPT 820. Here's the latest Chicago weather update.
From the Weatherology Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Michael Carroll. Cloudy skies with rain likely for this afternoon. Some patchy fog also possible. Highs in the lower 50s. And for tonight, rain looks to continue. Again, some patchy areas of fog, a low of 46. Looking to dry things out for your Saturday, just stuck with some cloud cover, lower 50s for highs, and a chance for rain returning for your Sunday, high of 46. And that's your latest Chicago weather update. Right now it's 50 degrees.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We have opened the phone line, so if you want to get in and have some conversation, please call 773-763-9278, or if you'd like to text some thoughts in, please do that as well. I just want to remind everybody that tonight on Driving It Home, WCPT's Paul Shivari will be in for Patty Vasquez. He'll be taking your calls and talking to Brittany Ruland, Iowa community advocate and political strategist. That's Driving It Home, weekdays from 5 to 7 on WCPT 820. That sounds like a really, really great show. All right, so we are going to go get back to the calls to talk about, again, anything that you're interested in talking in. We've got an hour of time to really kick things around. Why don't we go to Steve in the Gold Coast who wants to chat a little bit about one Donald Trump. Hey, Steve, how are you doing?
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. And I think you raised an interesting question. I mean, for people who don't do this for a living, there's an entire cohort within political science that's been talking about this going back decades.
Yeah.
And further, and it is this question of when do we get a dictator? Because unfortunately, the way that we've structured our Constitution, it gives a great. Hello, do you hear me?
Yep, I'm here. Oh yeah.
Yes. Okay. It gives a great framework where someone such as a Donald Trump can ascend to power. A lot of other democracies around the world have chosen not to go our route. They have chosen to give their chief executive less power for specifically this reason. And our system, we had I love George Washington, but unfortunately he sort of screwed it up for everybody because he was this great noble guy who said, no, I'm going to step aside. I don't want to be a king. And we thought that this was the blueprint for leadership in this country going forward. When in reality, a Donald Trump could come along at any time and simply say, no, I'm not going to give up power. I'm not going to respect the other branches of government. I'm just going to govern according to the way I want. And the fact is that a lot of people around the world like a strong man. They don't like the nuances and complexities that it is a democracy, and sometimes you have to compromise. And sometimes you have to compromise with people with whom you disagree.
Yes.
And so this is how we got Donald Trump. But again, people have been warning about the potential for Donald Trump for generations within our field. I remember 30 years ago at the American Political Science Association conference, sitting there listening to people talk about this. I mean, we've been lucky until now. But we've got a framework in place which allows for this.
And we tend to think that the institutions will protect us from somebody like Donald Trump. They'll protect us from a demagogue who wants to come in and upend those institutions. And we've quickly realized that norms matter a lot, right? George Washington and those early founding fathers, a lot of what they established were democratic norms. Well, you get somebody like Donald Trump comes along, he doesn't care about norms, and the institutions themselves can't constrain that type of demagogue or authoritarian behavior. And, one of the things, I think that you're absolutely right to say that this is a question that political science has long grappled with. And we know that political parties can be those institutions, right? They are one of the few institutions that can prevent, populist demagogues from rising to power. But we see in the United States, the Republican Party wasn't up to that challenge. And if the parties can't do it, there are very few ways. The voters are unlikely to do so. We will be persuaded by a populace quite easily. And so you're absolutely right that we have to rethink a lot of these institutions. And again, I'm deeply troubled, and I think you probably sense this as well, that we're drifting in a direction where we're simply normalizing very, very dangerous and authoritarian behavior.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's because of Donald Trump's presidency and the ascension of MAGA that a lot of Americans have come to realize that, there isn't really anything that says you can't do this, that we have been living for centuries vis-a-vis the honor system. So, when Donald Trump came along and, somebody said, oh, by the way, generally speaking, when you become president, you put your assets in a blind trust because, that's what's done, because obviously the president doesn't want to be perceived as profiting from his office. And then someone came along and said to him, oh, but you do know that that's just a tradition. There is nothing that actually forces you to do that. And Donald Trump said, well, then in that case, forget it. I'm not doing it. To release your health records, to release your tax returns. I mean, all of these things are just traditions that we've tended to honor. But Donald Trump comes along and says, if it's not the law, well, forget that. I'm not going to follow it.
Absolutely. And then you are also enabled by a Supreme Court right now, a conservative-leaning court that is granting the executive branch tremendous amount of power. I mean, you know well about the executive theory, the idea that the power is slowly accumulating in the executive branch. And this is something where, if you go back and think about what the founders really intended, I don't think they envisioned an executive branch as powerful as we have today. I don't think they would have appreciated the ways in which Donald Trump is abusing those institutions. Right? I mean, there's so much power vested in the president right now, and the Supreme Court continues to reaffirm that. I mean, we talked about the immunity decision, but all of these actions have the effect of giving the executive branch a tremendous amount of power with very few checks on that power.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm overstating it when I say, this is the most important country that has ever existed in the world. And the idea that the checks and balances that the Supreme Court represents in terms of their function can be overturned by something as simple as an aneurysm, a heart attack. That all of a sudden, X number of people die or retire during this person's presidency, and then you can remake the court such that they are pretty much a rubber stamp, the president. And that's all it takes to topple these centuries-long institutions that we built. It's ridiculous that we have not reformed the system until now.
It is so much easier to dismantle a democracy than to build it back up. And as you well know, within political science, a lot of people are writing about that. The way democracies die now is no longer, I talked about this on Monday, it's not militaries toppling a democracy. It's individuals who are elected by that democracy who use the tools of democracy to undermine democracy, right? And so as I think about the next 4 years of Donald Trump, my democracy alarm bells are going off saying, we have to pay attention to the ways in which he's trying to undermine the democratic process. And I think we're seeing it already, right, with the media, and so those institutions can't be complicit in this. ABC should not be settling with Donald Trump. There has to be pushback from all aspects to sort of prevent the democracy from being undermined. I am genuinely worried, yeah, go ahead.
And that's an important point, because Donald Trump does not get to where he is absent social media and absent these alternative outlets where people are increasingly turning to. And with all due respect, you can get your information where you want, but it's not the same thing when it comes to credibility. You can get medical advice from somebody who dropped out of school in the 9th grade. Right. There's a big difference from getting it from the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins when it comes to heart disease. But this is where we are, where you get your information from the New York Times. We can't trust the New York Times. But you can trust some guy doing a channel out of their parents' basement? This is your idea of equivalency when it comes to this epistemic question about where we get our information? It's ridiculous. But we've got an entire population out there who thinks Joe Schmo's YouTube channel, that's the alternative to ABC News. No, it is not.
No, and if you're going to have a fully functioning and engaging democracy, you've got to have meaningful civic education where people are getting factual information and having real conversations. And I think in the United States, it is important to have a liberal conservative conversation. You just don't want the Democrats. You also want the Republican Party, so you can have that back and forth. But that conversation isn't happening, and it's not happening in a thoughtful way. I think, Steve, you are highlighting some real dangers to the democracy. And I often feel as a political scientist like I'm ringing this democracy alarm bell. And since the election, nobody's listening anymore. And I get it, because I think everybody's worn out, and it's hard to constantly be fighting for democracy.
Yeah, and I agree with you. We used to have a time when you get a break, and then we start talking about the midterms, and we start talking about another presidential election. There is no time off any longer.
No,
and unfortunately, the people across the aisle, they're no longer the opposition. They're the enemy.
Yep.
There was a time when people like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill used to get drunk together.
Yeah.
After going at it. But, in today's society, no. It's I want that person in prison. I want them executed. This is the rhetoric that we see.
Absolutely.
There are literally people in the country, tens of millions who voted for Donald Trump, who would put Nancy Pelosi in front of a firing squad tomorrow if they could.
And I think
it's ridiculous.
It is. And the transition from Joe Biden, I think we're seeing the end of that previous era that you described, where it was, the other side wasn't your enemy, but somebody that you could engage with. And Steve, I got to move on to some other callers, but thank you so much. Okay. I always love having some good political science conversation. Thank you so much for calling in. Why don't we jump to Steve, who is in Glenview, and he's thinking about Trump and Iceland and normalization. Hey, Steve, welcome to the Joan Esposito Show.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Thanks for taking my call. I enjoy your show. Listen, I want to stay on message today. You talked about the normalization of Trump, and it's real, and it's a big concern. And the thing is, he's played the media like a fiddle since 2016. They wait with bated breath for anything he says, and they magnify it. And it's really been a key part of his strategy and propaganda from the MAGA folks. And it's, the Democrats, and we've got to get smarter and more aggressive. And that's a whole other topic. But it doesn't speak real well for the media to be kowtowing to Trump right now. You lose a lot of respect, but you got to remember, this is a for-profit business, as you well know, and they're out there for eyes and ears, and they want to make money, and they put money ahead of values in many cases. So that's the reality, and anything that can get people's attention, and of course their use of social media, I think was the key in the election, and that's another topic for discussion, but we all know that. I hope we all know that, because next time it can't happen. But the other thing I was going to say is that you mentioned his imperialistic comments about Greenland and Panama.
Yeah.
I find that very interesting because, he's been an isolationist up until now. He said, well, we got to get out of Ukraine. It's, and Syria is not our fight. And very much of an isolationist. And all of a sudden now he's ranting about Greenland and Panama, like you said, in a Christmas message. But this is what we got. This is what we elected, and we better buckle up and be prepared. It's scary, but this is what we got. I'm concerned, obviously.
Yeah, no, and I think to your point of there's no ideological consistency with Trump. If we think about foreign policy, you're right. He spent a lot of years talking about, I got us out of wars, I'm not war. And then before he's even taken office, he's talking about taking back Greenland and Panama Canal and Canada. Right there should be some ideological consistency, or at least some ideological position that explains your worldview. But that's not the case with Trump. He goes from one to the other, whether it's, he hates North Korea to suddenly he falls in love with Kim Jong-un, right? There's no consistency in his positions, and it makes it really, really difficult to have a policy if that's the case. The other, Steve, the other really thoughtful thing you said was pointing out that media are for-profit companies, right? So I talked about ABC News making the settlement, but we should really think about Disney, right? Because Disney is the parent company. Disney is the company saying, we don't want to alienate Donald Trump. We want to keep him on our good side. Let's do everything we can. And $15 million, that's small potatoes compared to the future business we might develop having a good relationship with Donald Trump. Same thing with Bezos and Zuckerberg and all of them. They're thinking about the economic impact of all of this. And I think that's really dangerous to move in that direction.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. You're right on.
Well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate you calling in, and I think you're spot on with making those connections there. We are up against a break, but we were going to get to some other callers in just a second. So if you want to call and talk about anything related to Trump or other issues, please feel to call 773-763-9278, and we will be right back on WCPT.
WCPT replay.
We're blessed to have our wonderful Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton with us this morning.
People have to understand the work that we have been able to do here in Illinois under Governor Pritzker's leadership and with our partners in the General Assembly is we have been able to put things in place, policies and laws, so that no matter who ended up in the White House this term, we would have protections here in Illinois. When I look at what we've done to protect reproductive freedom here in Illinois and enshrine the right to reproductive care, abortion care, what we've done to protect LGBTQ plus rights right here in Illinois, what we've done to protect workers' rights, the Workers' Rights Amendment, we raised the minimum wage, and so many other things. These are the progressive values that we have been able to make real progress on here in Illinois.
Keep listening to WCPT 820, because facts matter. This is a WCPT 820 Heartland Signal News Minute.
If we give up on Social Security, we don't deserve to be a political party.
That's Congressman Mark Pocan, Democrat of Wisconsin, speaking to Tom Hartman here on WCPT as Republicans escalate talk of dramatically cutting Social Security when they take control of the House, Senate, and the White House in the new year. Pocan said that he is quite sure that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries will lead the Democrats in strong opposition to Republican efforts to gut the program.
This is one of those issues that really separates us. On Inauguration Day, we have to be that party of FDR that looks out for the average person. That, unfortunately, I don't think that got across in November as well as it needed to be. And now is our chance to double down on that. And Social Security is absolutely one of those core issues.
For WCPT 820 and Heartland Signal, I'm Andy Miles.
Alexa, play WCPT.
WCPT from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We have the phone lines open. If you want to call in and chat, please do so. 773-763-9278. We also have the text lines open. And we actually just got a text from Indiana. And the caller said, thank you, Mitch McConnell. He could have cut Trump off at the pass after January 6th. And I think this is a really, really important point. As we think about the ways in which, what were the institutional checks that could have stopped Donald Trump? And one of them absolutely has been the Republican Party and the leadership of that Republican Party. Mitch McConnell had the opportunity to put some pressure on fellow Republicans to move forward and remove, vote for impeachment and remove Donald Trump from office and prevent him from returning again. And that wasn't the case. So I think we can really see the ways in which the party itself has enabled Donald Trump. And as we think about moving forward into this next Trump administration, it's important to think about what sort of checks are there on Donald Trump. Is the Republican Party going to be that? Is it going to be the media? Who is going to push back on Donald Trump? So, all right, we got a whole bunch of callers that we want to get to here. Lady B, can we get to Ron from Chicago? All right. Hey, Ron, how are you? Ron wants to talk a little bit about Canada and whether Canada might become the 51st state. Welcome, Ron.
Yeah, it would make more sense if Taiwan will be the 51st state. Then you can have missile bases over there close to China.
No, this is interesting, right? As we think about the what draws Donald Trump's attention and what does not, he seems to very much now these days care about the Panama Canal and Greenland and Canada, but hasn't said much about Taiwan, which actually is a really, really important strategic issue.
Right, and I can imagine that Trump wants to negotiate between being negotiating with Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, I can just imagine him telling Vladimir Putin that instead of invading Ukraine, we'll sell you Alaska. It's plenty of oil. And
yeah, well, Trump approaches foreign policy as a transactional relationship. And more often that transactional is what's going to benefit Donald Trump. And I think if we look back at the history, one of the courses I teach is American foreign policy, and we look at both Democratic and Republican administrations and how they've approached engaging the world. There's a remarkable consistency across Democratic and Republican administrations. They may go about that foreign policy in different ways, but at the heart of it, always thinking about what is in the U.S. interest. And what we see with Donald Trump is there's a different dynamic. It's really what is in and what would benefit Donald Trump. And I think it's really, really dangerous when the individual is more important than the country's strategic interest as a whole. That bothers me deeply.
Right. And one more thing, we ever take back the Panama Canal, I can imagine RFK Jr. saying that the drug to prevent yellow fever has caused autism. There'll be a...
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think all of it, it's hard to know how any of that would play out. I mean, the one thing we will say is Panama has been very clear. The leadership of Panama have said, hey, we have no interest in giving the canal back. We have no interest in selling the Panama Canal. Greenland, same thing. Whether it's Denmark or Greenland, officials from both of them have said, no, Greenland is not for sale. This is sort of silly that we're even having this conversation. Again, this is part of the great normalization of Trump. Ron, I really appreciate your thoughts. Okay. Thanks for calling in and sharing your ideas.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, why don't we jump to Cynthia? Cynthia's been on hold for a while, and she's calling from Denver, Colorado. Cynthia, I think we've talked once before. I spent 6 years of my life out in Denver. Absolutely loved it. Welcome to the WCPT show.
Well, thank you for hosting. I learned a lot from you the last time you were hosting and now. excuse me, I just wanted to say the normalization of Trump, we all can change that by announcing every time we mention anything about him, the convicted felon, our elected president. Why are we not saying convicted felon when we talk about him?
It's really interesting, right? Because I think language matters. My guess why ABC News, why they don't want to do, why nobody want to do that is you would be perceived as being partisan. But here's the question, right? So and sometimes being partisan is really just being pro-democracy, right? If we're thinking about if you're a media organization, it's important that we're honest in describing what's happening in that democracy. And if you have a convicted felon who is soon to be the next president of the country, we should be honest in terms of how we describe them. But I think a lot of those media companies are uncomfortable as being perceived as partisan, so they pull back, right? They are chilled. And again, we should give Donald Trump credit. He is very effective at intimidating them. But I think you're spot on in terms of how the fight needs to move forward.
Well, and I think you, everyone should say that the first time we start speaking about him. And the other thing is that, the media, like you said earlier, has to earn money. I guess that's okay, but at the expense of the country, why can't we put things in terms like that? Why can't the Dems, and I speak about it every time I mention something on Yahoo, what I'm sharing with you. Yeah. Excuse me, but also I wanted to say, people. Are not all afraid of Trump. What we're afraid of is how it's being so clear that there's two separate forms of justice, and when Trump is not being held accountable, but he's inciting and insinuating that he's going to be the rule of law and retribution, it really, really gives us a black eye as a country, as a people. It just really muddies everything, and I don't understand. Separate the money part. See, the money part gets in the way because our country is going to hell in a handbasket based on the fear of being partisan, the fear of not getting that interview because there's money to be made, and it really is sickening. And the sad thing is that the people, I included, will suffer because of the choices and the lack of information. And furthermore, because half the country gets their news from different unreliable sources, isn't it up to the people who have a microphone to educate about what's going on or how the government works every time they speak? I mean, it's the miseducation of America is glaring.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially as you think about the bigger networks. I mean, that's why, the Washington Post or the LA Times or ABC News, these examples we spent a lot of time talking about, they matter because they're big, right? It's the Des Moines Registers. I worry about them because that's a different dynamic. They don't have deep pockets, but the Washington Post should be able to push back. The LA Times should be able to push back. And if they're intimidated, it really suggests that the playing field is tilted against facts and it's tilted against democracy because Donald Trump will use those advantages to benefit his own sort of authoritarian tendencies, right? And to an earlier point you made, right? It's important that we call it out. I think Donald Trump certainly behaves in the way that authoritarians behave, and we shouldn't be afraid to describe it as that. I mean, in the field of political science, we sort of know Trumps. Like, we sort of say, he fits in a certain category, and it's easy for political scientists to say that, but Cynthia, nobody listens to political scientists, right? I mean, they listen to the big media companies, and that's really, really important.
And furthermore, if you go into the bowels of our country, in the hoods, and I hate to use the word ghetto, but we see these kind of people, they're drug dealers. His behavior is similar to drug dealers, mob figures.
Yep, yeah.
So we are very familiar with his behavior, and why America is putting up with it, we can only assume it's, because of his color. Obama would never get away with not even a second.
No, absolutely. No, I think this is a really, really good observation. Right? He oftentimes feels like a mob boss to me, right? And he's engaging in very similar tactics. He's trying to intimidate. He's trying to be a big bully. And you're right. He is allowed to do so, but there are a whole host of other politicians that couldn't do. I mean, Kamala Harris, she couldn't behave that way, right? I mean, there's a double standard there, and it's deeply, deeply troubling. And again, this is why we're at such a precarious moment here. He's not even in office yet, but we have to start thinking through what will be coming next. And again, how you push back against that. As a political scientist, I'm thinking about the patterns that we've seen throughout history, and how do we prevent this from the U.S. democracy drifting in a more, undemocratic direction?
Yeah. Well, I guess I just hold my breath, and, I'm not even, this is the first time I can ever remember, and I'm 66 years old, not being enthusiastic about the upcoming new year.
No, and I think you're not alone there. There's a lot of people who are just, it feels like you're in one country, and then an election happens, and you realize it's not exactly the country you think it is. And again, that's democracy. It's messy, but this one is a tough one because it does hurt. And no, I very much feel that sentiment. We're up against the break, Cynthia. Thank you so much for calling. You really, really thoughtful insights. I think we all learned from you today as well.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. All right, we've got to get to a break, but we've got a whole bunch of callers. When we come back, we will get to them on WCPT.
This is a WCPT moment in labor. On March 25th, 1911, in Manhattan, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory killed 146 workers, who were mostly women. The victims of the fire were unable to leave the burning high-rise building due to the exits being locked and were forced to leap to their deaths from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Locking doors was a common practice to reduce theft and unauthorized breaks at workplaces. As a result of the fire, the New York State Legislature formed the Factory Investigating Commission, whose findings led to 38 new laws regulating labor. Some of the new laws mandated better egress, the installation of better alarm and sprinkler systems, and increased availability of fire extinguishers. Coincidentally, the American Society of Safety Professionals was formed, which now manages, researches, and consults occupational safety and health across 75 countries. This has been a WCPT Moment in Labor. We are working for your rights.
Driving under the influence of marijuana is illegal, and law enforcement officers can tell when you're driving high. If you feel different, you drive different. Drive high, get a DUI. Paid for by NHTSA.
AP News, I'm Jackie Quinn.
The judge received the indictment today.
Prosecutors in New York City have added additional murder counts and arson charges against the man accused of burning a woman to death last Sunday in a subway car. Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez says they're hoping for a conviction against 33-year-old Sebastian Zapata.
There is no death penalty in the state of New York, so that's why the maximum penalty here is life without the possibility of parole.
Zapata was seen on surveillance video watching the unidentified female victim burn. He's in the U.S. without authorization from Guatemala. In another New York case, State Attorney General Letitia James has released body cam footage of a detainee being fatally beaten at a state prison in Oneida County. 43-year-old Robert Brooks died hours after he was repeatedly pummeled by corrections officers. The White House is weighing in on reports Israeli forces burned a hospital in Gaza after forcing its staff out onto the street. National Security spokesman John Kirby says there needs to be a full investigation into whether Hamas was operating there.
They should speak to how they're dealing with that threat. We don't want to see hospitals as the scene of conflict.
A new report from the U.S. government shows a spike in homelessness of 18%. Officials say a lack of affordable housing, severe weather, and an influx of migrants are among the factors. Russia's not saying if an anti-missile system might have accidentally shot down a passenger jet from Azerbaijan. Our Charles de Ledesma reports.
Aviation experts say the Russian air defense fire was likely responsible for the Azerbaijani plane crash that killed 38 people.
NASA's confirmed a spacecraft, the Parker Solar Probe, has made the closest approach ever to the sun. This is AP News. A California hotel made famous in the 70s by the group The Doors has been consumed by fire.
The former Morrison Hotel, which was famously on the cover of a 1970 album by The Doors, has been significantly damaged by a fire in downtown Los Angeles. The LA Fire Department says the 4-story building burned for nearly 2 hours. More than 100 firefighters helped bring the fire under control. I'm Haya Panjwani.
The White House says another telecommunications firm has been hacked as part of a sprawling Chinese espionage campaign. It gave officials there access to private text messages and phone conversations of an unknown number of Americans, and that includes prominent politicians. I'm Jackie Quinn, AP News.
This is 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and streaming worldwide at WCPT820.com. We are Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Now, your WCPT 820 weather update.
From the Weatherology Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Megan Mulford. Heavy rain likely, with fog and spots early this afternoon. Otherwise, cloudy skies expected. Daytime highs approaching 51, southeasterly winds 10 to 15 miles an hour. Cloudy skies expected again. Tonight, heavy rain likely. Lows dip down to about 46. Cloudy skies expected tomorrow. Slight chance for rain, which could be heavy. Highs level off around 50. That's your latest Chicago weather update. Currently, it's 50 degrees.
The Thom Hartmann radio program provides all of the intelligence, information, and insight you'll need to win the water cooler wars. Weekdays 11 to 2 right here on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Chicago's progressive talk, WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We have been taking calls and having some really, really fun conversation here. Just want to remind everybody that on Sunday on Out Chicago, Scott Duff and Ellen Miller have selected a few of their favorite interviews from the past year for part 2 of a 2-part year-end special. Tune in to hear interviews with Death Becomes Her star Michelle Williams, singer and satirist Randy Rainbow, Michael Johnson of Equita, Illinois, and Jen Grosshandler and Jariah Goldstein of the Gender Cool Project. It's Chicago's only live broadcast for the LGBTQ community, Sundays from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central on WCPT. All right, let's get back to the callers. We've got Marilyn in Chicago who wants to talk about Trump and January 6th. Welcome, Marilyn.
Hi. So nice to talk. Oh, look at my dog trying to get that on.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the little doggies.
No, what I wanted to say was, is that music on my part?
I'm not hearing any music.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, good. No, what concerns me is, on January 6th, 170 police officers were injured. There were 5 deaths from either suicide or injury. And, where's the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police? They didn't support Kamala Harris. They never have denounced this. He says he's going to pardon these people. And the police are okay with that? I don't understand it. They're such big Trump supporters. And I just think if, George Floyd protesters had done an insurrection into the Capitol and were beating police officers like that, they probably would have killed hundreds of them. And they only shot one person.
It is.
And that's really... Go ahead.
No. You continue. Sorry.
No, I mean, that just really bothers me and George Floyd's issue was real. Derek Chauvin went to prison for murder. And, Donald Trump has gone to over 60 judges, and they all said he doesn't have an ounce of evidence that the election was stolen.
Yeah.
And so I just wish the police would come out, because I think if Biden were to come out, there was 2% of the 25 million people that protested for George Floyd. Some of those people were violent. You know how they broke into the Macy's store, they broke into some stores. Very small percentage. What if he would call them patrons and heroes, and I'm going to pardon all of them? Because, a lot of those people are in jail now in their behavior. Yeah. What if he would call them patrons and heroes, and I'm going to pardon them? The police would go nuts on him, and I believe he would be impeached by the Republicans.
You're making some really thoughtful points, and in particular, like the struggle that we're seeing play out over history and the rewriting of history, right? And thinking about, you were talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd movements. Those were, the data is overwhelming. I'm trying to think I read an article recently talking about, it was an academic piece, that was at 96% of them were absolutely nonviolent. It was a handful of them where there was minor violence. So when you think about a movement that was nonviolent, pushing for rights, pushing for racial justice, but think about how that has been portrayed and the history. And so instead of seeing that as, in some way that's the type of protest and democracy that we should be encouraging, right? Nonviolent protest, but the rewriting of history and turning that into violence, right? And again, I think we see, if you ask people out there about the Black Lives Movement, they will say, violent protests over and over again, but that's missing reality. And then to flip it as well, to think about January 6th. And I think what we're seeing right now is Donald Trump is engaging in an effort to rewrite that history, to turn these January 6th individuals, those that have been convicted, into political prisoners, to turn them into heroes. And that's also deeply problematic, right? We think about the terms that we use, and Christopher Wray, the outgoing FBI director who was appointed by Donald Trump, He has attacked the individuals who carried out January 6th and said they are terrorists. But what you're seeing out of Donald Trump is a reframing of that history, talking about them as heroes, talking about them as political prisoners. And this is what we're watching play out here. And again, history can be manipulated, and it's so important that we sort of engage meaningfully in that process of trying to objectively and empirically tell that history. And again, Donald Trump is an actor who's trying to shape that in ways that are disconnected, I would argue, from reality itself.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I know. I went to actually 3 protests myself in the George Floyd thing in the city of Chicago. Not an ounce of violence. Nobody behaved inappropriately. I even went up to police officers and said that I don't have disrespect for you. I want you to know that I'm here because I'm supporting a person that I believe was murdered. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But I wanted them to know I don't hate you. And you know what? They told me how much they appreciated that I would say that.
Well, that's important, right? And we see the difference between the perception of those movements versus the reality of those movements. And again, Donald Trump has a unique megaphone where he can try to redefine that. But at some level, right, the data is the data. We know that a high percentage of those were absolutely peaceful. The movement as a whole was peaceful, but it gets reframed differently. And again, this is history. History is a battle for ideas and who gets to write that story.
Right. I know because most of the Trump people that I know, because I have a few family members that are Trumpsters, they think the George Floyd protests were all violent too. And I try to explain to them, no, very small percentage,
Absolutely. And the data there is very, very clear. There's a scholar at Harvard, Erica Chenoweth, who's done work on this and looked at these protests. And you can catalog them, right? And I can't remember if the number is 94 or 96, but it's a high percentage that were peaceful protests.
High percentage.
Yeah, but the perception of that is very, very different. So, well, Marilyn, thank you so much for calling. We got to move on to get some other callers, but I really appreciate your perspective. Thank you. All right, let's move to Eduardo, who's calling from Tampa. I love that you're not in the Chicagoland area. Welcome, Eduardo.
Oh, yeah. Hello from sunny Tampa, 70-something degrees here.
Oh, yeah. It's not like that in Chicago. Yeah. It was rainy and I think 45 when I drove in today.
Yeah, and my younger brother from Chicago, we're from Midway Airport. He's visiting here for a couple months. So, but he goes back because last year he came and he still went back. So there'll still be somebody from the family in Chicago, yeah. I wanted to move on here. I know we got some things coming up in there. I noticed when I'm listening, I listen to both sides. Some things might come off as offending, but I'll try not to do it come off as offending. But I'm listening to a lot of these callers, and I don't see a lot of young people calling racists. Obviously, they're on social media. But and I listen to a program that I really am interested in, because one of the things is trade schools. I'm a Jones graduate. I went to St. Rita, but I'm a Jones graduate.
Sure.
And if people are going to get really excel, in my opinion, I don't think we should have college because of the internet. If we didn't have technology, yeah, it would be fine to go to college. But we have internet, we don't need college. When you get out of high school, you should have a skill. If you know language, hey, that's great too. People in Europe, they know, 10 languages? There's a man from Rwanda, 30 languages.
Yeah.
Some of these people, from South America, and South America and Africa, I mean, they do pretty well. I mean, mommy and daddy weren't exactly on the high-end scale, but it also requires discipline because whatever you're going to be able to be successful in life, you have to have a discipline before you can learn something.
No,
I think.
Eduardo, so as a college professor, I might push back a little bit on the idea we don't need college, but here's what I would say. I think we need a multitude of ways and opportunities for individuals to pursue, and I think we should think about civic education for all of those, right? I mean, I think the value, of college from my perspective is that it allows people to think and reflect and sort of understand the complexity and the grayness of life and that there's different perspectives, but you don't have to go to college to get that. There's other places where you can have those conversations. But if we're going to be a robust democracy, we have to find a variety of ways of elevating that discourse. And again, it doesn't have to be college. It can be, in terms of media outlets. It can be thinking about conversations around the water cooler, right? But I think in general, we need to find ways to elevate our conversation about politics. I've long argued that I think our political discussions are far too often sort of very, very dumb, right? We're having dumb conversations when we're debating about whether the Haitian immigrants are eating the pets in Ohio. That's a dumb conversation, right? We should spend our time differently. But you're right to say that there are a variety of opportunities and not everybody needs to go to college. But I think in general, I'd like to see the discussion.
More choices, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, more choices. Yeah. Have a little bit more balance. You should be able to know by the end of high school where do you think you're going to be going. I'm interested in this area more than this area, and then pursue that. Network. I think a lot of people, I did a lot of networking. Actually, one of the persons that sold my house in Chicago, I met through a networking event.
Yeah.
So I think more people should do more networking to find success in life.
No, absolutely, right? I can totally see that, thinking about that there isn't just one pathway, and that pathway doesn't have to be college. I mean, again, as a college professor, I'm a tad biased on this, and I think if you have the opportunity to go to college, it can be a wonderful opportunity and experience. But in general, I think there are many ways, and the reality is that our world and our economy is shifting in ways that higher education and education in general is going to dramatically shift. I think about, artificial intelligence. We're just sort of scratching the surface of that, and over the next 25 years, the way in which we exist and how we live, it's going to be transformed by technology, and we have to think more about that.
What is your sorry to talk over you. What is your solution with tuition? How can we get away?
Yeah, you know what?
I
think
help them, they're just going to raise up the tuition. I mean,
right. Here's what I would say. I think we have to think holistically about how we reduce or make college more affordable for those who want to pursue that, because it's a real burden, and it's a privilege for certain individuals. But no, I think this is a long term. Probably don't have enough time to really get into that, but it's a really important issue. So Eduardo, I'm against the break, so we got to get going. But thank you so much for calling.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Causing us to think a little bit more about the future. So we're going to take another break, and then we've got a couple more callers we'll get back to right after this on WCPT.
Stephanie Miller.
Bob Cesca joins us now.
Oh, God, shut down the internet. Can we just shut it down? We just got to unplug it. We need a timeout from the internet.
Yeah.
All of American society. I think, you know what? I say that half jokingly, but the other half is like, as someone who worked his entire career on the internet, I feel like we just weren't evolved enough. We weren't ready when it came along. Came along way too soon.
Stephanie Miller, weekday mornings 8 to 11 on WCPT 820.
This is a WCPT Moment in Labor.
When Serena Williams won her title at the Tennis Grand Slam tournament, we know she gets the same prize money as her male counterpart. However, prior to 1973, that wasn't always the case. When Billie Jean King captured her first Wimbledon title in 1966, she was surprised to find out that the winner of the men's tournament received £2,000, while she only received £750. After being unable to find any tournaments for women, King and 8 other women formed their own tournament, the Virginia Slims Invitational, where each woman was paid $1 before posing for the famous picture of them each holding up their dollar, with the caption, "Contract Pros." While the move was bold, the pay discrepancies continued. King threatened to boycott the 1973 U.S. Open unless the women were paid the same as the men. Thanks to a grant from Band Deodorant, both the men and women's singles would take home $25,000. Despite the progress at the U.S. Open, it wouldn't be until 1984 that the Australian Open would execute equal pay, followed by the French Open in 2006, and finally Wimbledon in 2007. This has been a WCPT moment in labor. We're fighting for your rights.
Because facts matter. You are listening to WCPT 820.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We've had the phone lines open. We're having lots of wonderful conversations. Let me just remind everybody that Monday in this time slot, John St. Augustine will be joining in, be in for Joan, and his guests include artificial intelligence and cybersecurity expert Dawn Christie. That's super fascinating. Artificial intelligence is so important. Julie Murphy, author of The Emotion Behind Money, Building Wealth from the Inside Out, and Chicago radio and TV personality Jennifer Weigel. Live, local, and progressive, weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. Central here on WCPT. So tune in on Monday. All right, let's get back to the phone lines. We've got Miss Mitchell in Des Plaines. Hey, Mitchell, welcome to WCPT. Mitchell, are you there?
Okay, maybe he put us on hold.
Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Mitchell, we can hear you.
So this is to the woman who talked about insurrection.
Yeah.
And the one thing that she fails to realize is that Trump was never, he was never prosecuted for an insurrection. And you talk about 2020 when George Floyd, did you realize the violence and all the chaos that happened in Chicago proper, and that the mayor was actually, she was put on notice for not protecting the South and West Side, but only really kept it, a protected edge, in the heart of the Gold Coast. So the whole idea that I would like to remind you and your listeners, if you're talking about history, you keep on talking about history, is that you have to be accurate. So when you say that WCPT facts matters, it doesn't. Because let me ask you this. What time was in American history where there was an insurrection? There are 2 of them. One happened in 2020 in Washington. Seattle, Washington. They took over a municipality body. They took over a municipality building for months. And the police didn't do anything. And in 1961, James Meredith, ex-Air Force, he was a black Air Force pilot. He wanted to go to University of Mississippi in Oxford. And they were not having it. Bobby Kennedy and JFK sent in the military because a guy named General Walker, who came from the John Burke Society, he incited an actual riot by bringing a hatchet and a high-piled rifle. And he basically set up 3,000 people. Actually, it was closer to 4,000. These were fellow people that lived in the community. They were police officers, and they were going to attack this guy. And Bobby sent in basically federal. He did the federal marshal aspect where he brought in about 300 federal marshals, and he goes, "Do not use your firearm." And then they waited, and they finally got to the president to bring in the military, which Eisenhower did during his term.
Well, so Mitchell, here's what I would say. I think you're right to say that we have to have factual conversations, and I would also say that there is space for disagreement on those. But one thing I would say, though, is as we're thinking about the protests in the aftermath of George Floyd, the data is clear. There certainly were pockets of violence, but the narrative that gets out there is that the pockets were that it was extensive violence, and the reality that's simply not the case. And if we're going to ground ourselves in objective evidence, we have to look at that data. And again, to realize that 90+% of those protests were absolutely peaceful, nonviolent. That's important because that helps us understand that history. As we think about January 6th and what happened there, I get that people can have different perspectives on that. And one could look at those individuals who charge the Capitol as being heroes, but it's not something that I think the evidence particularly supports, right? We think about them using violence to pursue their particular ends, which was upending an election. Now, I get they did not believe that election. They thought the election was stolen. But again, if we're going to have meaningful conversations, we have to ground ourselves in facts. And again, I think that if we think about, the Black Lives Matter protests versus the January 6th, I think what we're seeing is a contested history. And I think Donald Trump is attempting to portray those historical events inaccurately. And I think that's really, really important that we ground ourselves in that history. I guess I'm in general avoid using the word terrorism because I think that's difficult to define. But I feel very, very comfortable using the term insurgent to describe what happened on January 6th. These are individuals who used violence to upend an election. And, whether Donald Trump should be charged with insurgency or, there's that sort of gets in the legal case, that's separately. But I think it's easy to describe it that way. And again, I'm very, very uncomfortable describing the Black Lives Matter movement and protests as being violent simply because the overwhelming majority, upwards of 95% of those were not. And I think it's important that we're accurate there. All right, let's jump to Al in Franklin Park, who's been waiting in a while and wants to talk a little bit about Trump.
Hi, how you doing today?
Doing great, Al. Good to talk with you.
All right. I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that Trump is only a pawn in this game, and we have to realize that because we have to follow the money, and it has to do with the oligarchs, the fascists, and the Christian nationalists that are all in there running the game and using him as a pawn. And when you look at it that way, you get a bit of a different perspective, and these guys have been playing the long game, and they are also all colluding together to all get their goals. And Trump is a vessel for that, and they're ready to go. They are I listen on conservative radio. I'm listening on terrestrial TV where the Christian nationalists are saying we have to get our biblical principles into government, and this is our chance to do it. We have the Charlie Kirks out there that are talking about what they want to do in this new administration, and it's all scary as heck, but I got to kind of look at this in a positive way that this is all being exposed, and we have to expose it. And the other big point is that these guys are really controlling our media right now, and that's radio, TV, internet, and somehow we got to break through that. They have this trickle-down media right now where they tell everybody what they should say, and they say it. And trickle-down and AstroTurf.
Yes. No, Al, here's what I would say. I don't disagree with you to think about, like, if we're going to understand the U.S. political system right now, we need to be thinking about the role of oligarchy, right? I think that's really interesting, especially as we think about Elon Musk. And not just Elon Musk, but the sheer number of billionaires who are currently in Trump's cabinet, right? That suggests an important shift in the political system, right? That we've got individuals with significant wealth and power who are influencing the political system. And the other group that you mentioned, you were talking about Christian nationalism. Absolutely, right? We're seeing those ideas and those groups have access to Donald Trump and certainly are attempting to sort of shape policy through Donald Trump. I guess the one area I might disagree with you talked about him as a pawn. And if you go on social media right now, you see lots and lots of images of Elon Musk as sort of the puppet master of Donald Trump. But I'm not so sure I agree with that. I think that if we think about Donald Trump, he is somebody who still centers the power within his own sort of operation, right? And he allows these other individuals to engage with him. And what I'm most curious about is how does this relationship with Elon Musk over the long haul play out? I mean, Elon Musk is an accomplished individual, been very successful, used to having lots of power as well. How do he and Donald Trump coexist? Because, even today we've seen that they have very different views of the government. So Elon Musk is, really thinking about, just today there was there's a debate over skilled worker visa programs, and Musk is pushing for that, which makes sense given the economic interests he has. That's very different from Donald Trump, who has a much more sort of economic nationalist view of the world. How can these two coexist? Do they start butting heads? And at the end of the day, my prediction is that Elon Musk probably loses out in this one, just because the type of personality that Donald Trump is that he doesn't usually allow anybody to challenge his dominance. But we will see. I don't know. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I agree, but I still think that even Elon Musk is a pawn, and this is an international game where we have Putin in there giving money to Elon Musk to buy Twitter, and he is currently on our social media trying to make us argue about why we lost the election and what Kamala Harris could have done differently. And all these things are happening now. They have troll farms working on us. So it's bigger than just Trump and Elon Musk, and they're all colluding together. And that's my thought, is this is an international fight between democracy and autocracy.
I wouldn't. No, this is really. I wouldn't deny that the battle for democracy has a global element to it. I might point more. Thanks so much for the call, Al. We got to jump to a break here, but I might point more to Russia as we think about the role of oligarchy and the way in which Putin has surrounded himself with oligarchs. And Putin, at the end of the day, is still the most important actor, and he is the one that drives the agenda. And if you challenge Putin, you're going to be pushed out of that inner circle. But I think it's an interesting example, right? And the democracy is definitely moving in a different direction with Donald Trump as presidency, and I think we're likely to see more billionaires in those roles, and it's going to be a really fascinating test case to see how the democracy can navigate all of that. All right, well, we've got to get to a break, but when we come back, we're going to be joined by a couple economists, Brandon Sheridan and Andrew Greenland, to talk about tariffs, the global economy. Very, very exciting stuff. We'll be back in just a couple minutes on WCPT.
WCPT replay.
Brian Tyler Cohen joins us. Yay.
I feel like Democrats are always 10 years behind on recognizing the threats of something that's being propped up by Republicans. How many years did it take us before we recognized that Republicans were gerrymandering state after state after state? And they had a 10-year head start, and they gerrymandered most of the country. I mean, it's still happening. We look at the 3 seats that Republicans won in North Carolina. Well, there's a roughly 3-seat margin that Republicans will win the House by. And so they owe their majority yet again to the fact that they were able to gerrymander seats in this election cycle in the House. And now with the media, it's happening again, and Democrats have to stop conferring all of their attention and validation onto mainstream media, who is not on our team. They serve a very important function and purpose, but it's not to be a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party in the same way that Fox, Newsmax, OAN, Rumble, those are all propaganda arms of the Republican Party, and the asymmetry at play is what's killing us.
Keep listening to WCPT 820, because facts matter.
This is an important announcement for anyone who wants health insurance, even if you missed the deadline. Right now, you can get the health insurance you and your family need from top insurance providers, even if you have pre-existing conditions or no insurance at all. The Plus Benefits Health Insurance toll-free number has been extended to help anyone who wants health insurance coverage now, or if you need a better plan or a lower price. Call Plus Benefits Health Insurance now at 800-378-1388. The call is 100% free and the help is real. Call 800-378-1388. That's 800-378-1388.
You're listening to WCPT 820. Here's the latest Chicago weather update.
I'm meteorologist Ray Miller from the Weatherology Weather Center. Rain continues tonight with areas of fog developing and a low temperature of 46 degrees. South winds at 15 to 30. Saturday, cloudy. Temperatures holding steady in the upper 40s with gusty southwest winds. Sunday, chance of rain and a high of 45 degrees. Monday, partly sunny with high temperatures in the mid-40s. Tuesday, rain likely and a little bit of light snow mixing in with a high temperature around 42 degrees. That's your latest Chicago weather update. Right now, it's 50.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are thrilled to be joined by our next two guests, Brandon Sheridan, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Elon University, and Andrew Greenland, Assistant Professor of Economics at North Carolina State University. They are here to help us make sense of all this tariff talk and to get a broader sense of what is going on in both the world and the U.S. economy. Welcome, Brandon and Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having us. Thanks so much for the chance to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to pick your brains. I pretend to be an economist a lot of the times, but I'm so glad to actually talk to some real experts. So, Brandon, let's start with you because you deserve extra praise for joining us all the way from Puerto Rico, where you are taking some time away from your vacation to join us. I envision you sitting on the beach enjoying adult beverage. So while you're doing all of that, there's a lot of confusion out there about tariffs. So if you could start just with some basic background information about tariffs. You know, we hear them talked about all the time in the news, but it's fair to say we don't actually understand them very well. So break it down for us. You know, what is a tariff and why and when do we see states use them?
Sure. So in simplest terms, a tariff is just a tax on imports. There's different ways to structure a tariff. They essentially will boil down to a couple types. You have a specific tariff, or an ad valorem tariff is sort of the technical term for that. So a specific tariff is pretty simple. Just means that you have a set dollar amount for each good that comes into the country. The ad valorem tariff is a percentage of the value of the good. So it's just a slightly different way to get at a similar objective. You know, the overall impact, though, is that the tariff is going to raise the cost of the good for the consumer. So tariffs make things more expensive for us. I think the other thing that's important, you know, for people to understand about tariffs is that tariffs are not paid by foreign countries. You know, so I know the incoming administration has, talks a lot about the tariff money we're going to be getting from China and other countries, but that's not something that's just not how tariffs work. So tariffs come from U.S. citizens that are paying those taxes on goods as they come across the border.
Interesting, fascinating. Now, Brandon, so talk to us about like how often these are used. I mean, are there tariffs in everyday economic issues? Is this more rare? Like, how often are these used by states and specifically the United States?
Yeah, so I mean, tariffs are on a lot of products, across a range of different industries. So tariffs are really common. The U.S. is part of the World Trade Organization, which means that the U.S. and other countries that are members of that organization typically face lower or no tariffs if you're, with the most favored nation status and things like that. But yeah, tariffs are very common for a long time, or at least for the past, few decades. We've been working on lowering these average tariff rates between countries, which is good for consumers. It helps us keep prices lower, and we've started to see that trend somewhat reverse a little bit recently. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, Andrew, I want to get you in on this. So, and Brandon tells me that you're like the real deep expert on tariffs. So, one of the biggest points of confusion, and Brandon sort of hit on this, is that increased tariffs would have what it would have on the U.S. economy. Some talk about it as a tax. Other, Donald Trump talks about it as something that would be accrued to the United States. Can you help us understand sort of deeper, a little bit ways in which these tariffs that Donald Trump are talking about, how they might impact the U.S. economy?
Yeah, so what Brandon touched on is right. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods that come into the U.S. And the way they work is basically
an administration might put a tariff on something if they think that the U.S. economy is not competitive relative to the rest of the world in producing a good. And so they'll put a tax on the foreign good to try and convince consumers to buy the U.S. produced version of that good instead. Now that assumes that the U.S. is capable of producing a version of that same good. Okay, so we don't want to put right now big tariffs on things like, for example, microprocessors and computer chips, which are produced extensively in places like Taiwan, because the U.S. currently doesn't produce enough of them to make us a viable alternative. And so if we were to do that, it's just really raising the prices of things we would consume. If you were to put tariffs on things that the U.S. could produce, what does that mean? Well, because you're trying to add sort of a little bit of a buffer for domestic producers, the whole idea is you're allowing the domestic producer to raise their price to become a little bit more competitive. And so the reality is when you put a tariff on something, the hope from the incoming administration is that by shifting consumption back to domestic producers, that might allow them to raise the number of employees they hire. So it could boost employment. It could shift that consumption back. But if it does that, if it's really shifting consumption back to the U.S., then that means U.S. consumers are not buying any foreign goods, which means we're not collecting any of that tax revenue. So you really can't have it both ways here, where a tariff gives the government tax revenue and it kind of boosts employment. It's either really one or the other, or a subtle mix of the two. When we look at what happened the last time these tariffs were put in 2019 under the last wave of tariffs under the Trump administration, it looks like really the bulk of the tariffs were passed right on to consumers. So if it was a 10% tax on a Chinese import, U.S. prices of those Chinese imports really went up by about 10%. And so that means that the U.S. consumers were really bearing most of that cost. It's a great sort of targeted policy in an old school world.
Yeah.
But in the modern economy, it's pretty tricky. You know, you imagine putting a tariff on steel and you think, hey, we're going to protect U.S. steel producers. That's great, unless you're an automotive producer, and now you're paying more for steel. And so that actually, the fact that we've got so many integrated supply chains makes it pretty tricky to use tariffs in a strategic way like this.
So Andrew, as we think about, like, obviously there's lots and lots of worry about inflation and the prices going up. Is there any way, if you were to put if Trump were to put a 25% tariff on goods from Mexico or Canada or China, whatever that might be, is it possible to do that and not have these inflationary pressures? Is that just inevitable? If you do that, you're going to see prices go up?
So I just want to put this in context here. The U.S., for basically from the 1990s onward, has been facing a general tariff an average tariff of about 2.5%, maybe down to 1.5%. That means if I were to be able to produce a good here in the U.S., or I bought it in Mexico and brought it into the U.S., it's only about 1.5% tax if I bought it from Mexico.
Yeah.
When we're talking about 25% tariff, we're talking about moving tariff levels back to things we haven't seen since the 1940s. So this is a really enormous step back, and it really is a 25% tax on everything. Compared to a 1% tax, this is a big shift. So in a world where we're concerned about prices going up, it's a big problem. And as I was hinting at a bit earlier, the problem isn't just the direct effects. It's the fact that the supply chains in the world economy are so integrated that even if you wanted to just put a tariff on something like, I'm just going to pick on steel because it was one of the last ones that was such a big issue, you might be doing some beneficial things for U.S. steel, for example, but any producer in the U.S. that uses steel as an input, automotives, mobile homes, construction, you name it, all of their costs are going to go up. And when their costs go up, they're going to pass those costs on to consumers. That means consumers are going to buy less stuff. That means firms are going to be able to hire less people because consumers are buying less, so they need to produce less. So it's a really tricky thing to think you're going to impose a tariff here and control what the knock-on price effects are worth.
I mean, so this sounds like a fairly dramatic impact, right? I mean, we think about, as you talk about the interconnectedness of all this, Yeah, in political science, so like when we talk about political economy, one of the things, the big narrative is that coming out of World War II, there was a real effort on the political side of things to build global networks where states' economies were intertwined. So maybe going back to Brandon on this one, is there a consensus within the field of economics of if we move away from this, if we start putting up tariffs and tariff barriers, does that make it, I mean, what would the big impact on the global economy be? I mean, I know, political scientists talk about decreasing the pressure of war by intertwining economies. As an economist, what is the thinking on free trade versus tariffs in terms of the global dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I think any economist you ask, if you said, should we have tariffs or should we have free trade, they're going to say free trade, right?
That was my sense, yeah.
Yeah, I think, that allows, as Andrew was talking about, that allows for lower prices, greater variety of goods and services, more efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. But, as we seem to be moving towards, a less globalized world, or at least there's some pushback against the globalized integrated economies, the question naturally arises is what's going to replace that? And, I think Janet Yellen, I think, made some remarks in 2022 where she referenced building out trade and having a modernization of this multilateral approach to trade, and by deepening sort of economic integration, but with our friends and our trusted trade partners, and doing that in a more focused way. I don't necessarily know what that looks like, but to me, it sounds like more regionalization, possibly, of trade. So you see, Russia is causing havoc right now, and so who have they relied on? They're relying more on India and China for trade because they don't necessarily have access to the same markets that they did before. What does it look like going forward? If Russia and China and India start to decouple from the United States and the dollar, I mean, there's all sorts of ramifications that could come from that. So I don't know that there's any sort of settled consensus within the econ about, how that's going to look. But I definitely think that we're probably better when we're integrated and working together and dependent on each other.
You hear a lot of terms, U.S. political circles talk about a decoupling from China. Is that even possible? I mean, Brandon, is it even possible for the U.S. economy to decouple from China at this point?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by decouple. Yeah. I don't think it has to be, one or the other. I think partly what you see is, in terms of currency, for example, like China's really pushing the renminbi and trying to get other countries to use that in international trade transactions. That could have big ramifications for the U.S., right? If the dollar loses some of its, some of its international prestige, that has big implications for things like interest rates in the U.S. and then, how much things cost, when we borrow money. So I don't know that it's possible to completely decouple, certainly not rapidly, but I think you're already seeing a gradual sort of shift away from, countries trying to decouple in some sense so that they have some diversification and are less beholden, I guess, to the whims of the U.S. policy.
Interesting. Andrew, so let's push a little deeper into the weeds on this. So is there a time when a targeted or a strategic use of a tariff can actually benefit a country? I mean, you mentioned chips. I mean, is it either for economic or security reasons? Is that something that states do, and can that be valuable?
Yeah, so I just want to be clear here. I'm gonna contradict Brandon just a tiny bit.
That's okay. He doesn't mind that.
Please.
No. I mean, I think I think there. Look, the reality is there have been rather persistent, sort of unexpected ex-ante labor market disruptions due to increased globalization. And, the rationale that Brandon is putting forward is, you want to grow the pie, as the economists would say. You cut tariffs to make everything efficient, and then you trust that the government will come up with an efficient set of transfers so that the winners who are benefiting from free trade compensate the losers. And I think part of what we are seeing is a backlash from a lack of a good global or national social safety net that would allow people who have lost jobs due to globalization being able to gain some kind of offsetting compensation that might help them shift into something else. And so there, there's starting to be kind of a debate about what the optimal level of a tariff might be when we start incorporating the sort of frictional nature of labor markets and how slowly they adjust. Putting all of that aside, there are still good reasons why one might, in theory, want a tariff. The problem is discerning truth from reality there.
Yeah.
You might want to protect an industry, and this was the initial rationale behind the initial wave of Trump tariffs, was that there were national security issues at play here. But the way they played that out in terms of the World Trade Organization was when the WTO said, there is an escape clause here where you can use a national security exemption to protect an industry. Show us the evidence that this is a national security issue. The administration said, I can't. It's classified because it's national security. Okay, and so
that doesn't sound like the U.S. government at all.
Well, but my right. I mean, so could that be true? Sure. Could it also be completely fabricated with plausible deniability about whether that's actually the motivation? Totally. And so, is there a reason why you might need industries? Is there a reason why, if you're a developing economy, you might want to protect agriculture just in case things go badly one year and you really need to make sure that in future years you have a domestic agricultural supply? Totally. But the U.S. is not really that kind of an economy. And so I have reservations when I hear justifications for tariffs that sound like they could be made in good faith, but really aren't. And the national security one is one that falls in that category to me.
And this is something the United States government struggles with transparency, both in terms of national security reasons as well as economic ones. So we got to take a quick little break. But when we come back, we're going to talk more, and I'm going to get Brandon and Andrew to weigh in on the state of the global economy as well as the U.S. economy. So we're going to take a quick break and be back on WCPT.
Make this season even brighter by lighting up every drive with the unrivaled performance of a new Porsche from the Porsche Exchange in Highland Park. Stop in today to test drive the latest models, including a new 2025 Porsche Cayenne. And right now, lease a new 2025 Macan Electric for $999 a month for 39 months. Visit the Porsche Exchange in Highland Park or PorscheExchange.com. 8,609 due at signing. Excludes tax, title, license, and dock fee. No security deposit required. Expires 1/2/25.
I am an American veteran. I'm proud to have served this country. Helping veterans is something all Americans can participate in, and it's as simple as donating an old car that you have sitting around. When you call the Veteran Car Donation Program, they'll explain how their program works, and then arrange a time they can come and pick up your vehicle for free. Running or not, it doesn't matter. They take cars, trucks, motorcycles, or vans. Show your support by donating your car and get a tax deduction in the process. Call the Veteran Car Donation Program right now. They'll come and pick your car up for free, and you'll get a tax deduction in the process. Call the number we're about to give you right now. Thank you, and God bless America.
Call 800-610-3690. 800-610-3690. 800-610-3690. 800-610-3690.
Hey Google, play WCPT.
Streaming Chicago's progressive talk from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are being joined by Brandon Sheridan, who's Associate Professor of Economics at Elon University, and Andrew Greenland, who's an Assistant Professor of Economics at North Carolina State University. And we were talking about, before we went to the break, we were talking about tariffs, but I also want to get a sense of what you all see as going on in the economy. So, Brandon, why don't we start with you? I'd love to get your assessment of the state of the U.S. economy as well as the global economy. We just went through this bitter presidential election where one's partisan perspective dictated whether the U.S. economy was a model for the world or an absolute disaster. What does the data really tell us about what we're seeing both here and globally?
Yeah, I think the Economist actually just came out with a piece on how the U.S. economy was still the model for the world. I don't know if that's necessarily true or false.
Yeah.
I would say that the U.S. economy is pretty strong right now. In my view, it was an odd strategy to me to watch the presidential election have kind of the Trump campaign talk about how bad the economy was, because now they have to come in and improve from that. And when I look at the data, I mean, you have unemployment is 4.2%. That's close to some of your historical lows. It's certainly like really, really low for unemployment rate. Sub 3% inflation. I know we just had a small tick up last month, but it seems to be kind of holding steady and in the general area where we'd want it. And you also have 3% real GDP growth. All of those things are really hard to improve upon. That being said, there are some things that could upset that balance. Tariffs are certainly not going to improve that. That could throw a bad wrench into things. I don't want to get it too into the financial market side, but bond markets have not been very nice recently. Interest rates have kind of gone in the opposite direction that the Fed has tried to push them, and so some of that, though, I think is looking at some of the uncertainty around the world and also rising government debt and deficit for the U.S. And things like that. So I think the U.S. is in a strong position, especially relative to the rest of the world. I think that the U.S. did a relatively good job, in hindsight, especially compared to their counterparts and responding to the pandemic and the inflation that ensued and things like that.
It's really interesting to sort of get that perspective, especially thinking about the global dynamics. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to think a little like a political scientist and talk about the broad trends you're seeing in the global economy. And specifically, people talk about use the phrase the neoliberal economic order and whether you think, is this model here to stay? I mean, we see critiques from the left and the right saying that, capitalism and neoliberalism over. I'm curious, what do you think? Does this model have legs? I mean, it's been here for a while. Do you feel like we're going to still be having the same conversations 25 years from now? What are you seeing in terms of long-term viability?
I mean, for the time being, at least the immediate future. I mean, so first of all, thank you for the softball question. But second of all, for as interconnected as the global economy is right now, and as much posturing as there is about decoupling, this is a really, really complicated process to try and, reshore or friendshore, or even handle these tariffs, right? I mean, one of the first things we saw was firms popping up in Vietnam and then in Mexico that were Chinese-owned, that were shipping stuff from those locations to avoid tariffs. Like, the whole global structure is so integrated that the idea of a sort of move away from a neoliberal, market-oriented economy, I think, is a pipe dream to some and far-fetched, I think, conservatively. I think there is some truth to recognizing that if we want to continue to realize the gains from integrated market economies, that being aware of the lack of a real social safety net, the fact that the gains from globalization in some places have been really captured by very few industries or firms or individuals, it's in the best interest of all members of society to realize that that system is only stable as long as everybody doesn't look around and realize that all of the wealth is being concentrated in a very small area. And so I think there is some serious introspection that needs to happen here in terms of making sure that we have the kind of societal health that allows markets to thrive. At the same time, we're actually concerned about people, their welfare, how easily they can find jobs, all of those things that sort of are assumed in economic models, but taken a bit more seriously on the political economy side of things.
Sure, because if the economic system doesn't benefit, it's hard to keep that political system operating and people want to attack it. All right, Brandon, I'm going to throw a curveball at you, and I'm just curious, I'm going to ask you about what's your thoughts on the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, and not like in deep thoughts, but I mean, he describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist, and he's slashing government spending, getting rid of government programs. He's about a year in office, and he is sort of the extreme libertarian. What's the economist perspective about what's going on in Argentina right now, and is that type of government slashing, is it going to work? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts about what's going on in Argentina?
Oh, wow. Well, again, thank you for the softball question. That would have been a good one to prepare for. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't think that I know enough to really give strong opinions on Javier Milei. I did enjoy watching his presidential campaign.
With the chainsaw.
He was very entertaining. I think, I think I think Argentina is still struggling a little bit, and so I don't know that he's in a position where he can kind of declare victory. I assume you're also sort of foreshadowing, the incoming Trump administration wanting to also get rid of massive entire departments and branches of the government. One of the key things to a robust economy is stability and predictability. And so when you introduce, instability into the economy, that's going to be worse for economic growth. And that's going to generally, lead to worse outcomes for businesses and individuals. The difference with Argentina is that was sort of the norm for them coming in was the instability. And so this is an attempt to sort of fix that. Whereas on the U.S. side, I think it would be a step in the other direction. So I'm not sure if that really gets at your question, but maybe I'll do some research after we talk, and I can come back on again.
No, there's no homework involved.
Okay.
But I appreciate. I don't know much about Argentina either, but I just find it curious that he's taken such an extreme approach to it, and whether that works or not. And again, I don't think Trump would follow that same pattern, but I do wonder a little bit about that. Andrew, Jerome Powell is the current federal chair of the Federal Reserve. Can you talk a little bit about how important his role is for the U.S. economy, and generally, what are economists thinking about how well he's handled that job, and maybe also thinking about how important is it for that role having some distance from normal political pressures? What are we thinking in terms of Jerome Powell?
Okay, so I don't want to get out over my skis too far here. I am really an international economist. Brandon is far more in the macro side, but I'm willing to be wrong in front of him here too.
I like it.
The short answer is, figuring out how to deal with the COVID inflationary transition, the problems with the supply chains, the problems with the absolute massive cash dump that happened in terms of fiscal policy and just pumping. I don't think anybody who was honest with themselves had any real sense of how that was going to shake out. There's so much uncertainty about the duration of the effects of the pandemic and how that had spilled over with tariffs to boot, that I think anybody who's trying to make headway there is doing a pretty good job. And I think, frankly, it's been a unique set of macroeconomic shocks where it's not really been a lack of demand that was causing short-term changes in unemployment. It was, pent-up panic about the pandemic more broadly. And so I think it's been a unique period for the Fed to try and deal with. But personally, I think he's been doing a good job here. I think the question you're really raising here is the importance about the separation between monetary policy and what the government is trying to do. And that actually turns out to be extremely important because in a world where the government acts what could be looked at as irresponsibly fiscally, overspending money to try and stimulate the economy to an aggressive extent for some kind of political gain, like boosting employment, to some extent the Fed can offset that with careful monetary policy and adjustment of interest rates. And so having these be two independent arms is actually an important tool, as Brandon was mentioning, for stability, so that you can't have somebody really come in and throw everything off the rails for short-term benefits. And so to the extent that you have an administration that's really trying to put political pressure, it's really in an effort to make sure that this sort of offsetting monetary policy of adjusting interest rates to sort of, you dump a bunch of money in the economy with checks that say this is given to you by our current president, and everybody's super excited about it, and then they go and spend all of that money all at once. That's going to heat things up really badly, and Powell has the capacity, at least to some extent, to offset that, right? To really try and slow that spending down, slow that aggressive employment growth down, and try and get an even-keeled economy. And so that separation between those two is actually extremely important for this long-term stability.
This has been so fascinating. I so appreciate both of you weighing in. We need to let Brandon get back to his vacation, but I will say real quickly, so we have the text line after that Argentina question, the texts are popping in. People want to learn more about Argentina, but just to remind everybody, so we've been joined by Brandon Sheridan, who's an associate professor of economics at Elon University. and Andrew Greenland, an assistant professor of economics at North Carolina State University. Brandon and Andrew, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it, and I think we all learned a lot from your insight.
Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Dr. Phil Barker to talk a little bit about Russia and what's going on there. Back on WCPT.
With MedGuard Alert, you're never alone. You can connect with medical professionals anywhere, anytime. And now MedGuard is introducing our exclusive new Care Watch. If you need help quickly, use it from anywhere to contact medical professionals. No cell phone required. The Care Watch is not only a life-saving medical alert device, it's a revolutionary health monitoring system that checks your blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, and much more. And here's the best part. If you have Medicaid, you may qualify to get your Care Watch for free. The Care Watch is only available through MedGuard Alert. Call us right now. We have monitoring programs starting as low as $1 a day. The call is free, activation is free, shipping is free, and no contract is required. Remember, with Medicaid, you may qualify to get your Care Watch for free. Call us to get your Care Watch right now.
800-741-5819. 800-741-5819. 800-741-5819. That's 800-741-5819.
Struggling with high cloud hosting costs and endless management headaches with your Microsoft Azure or AWS environment? Contact AmericanEagle.com for an assessment and see how they can save you time and money.
AP News, I'm Jackie Quinn. A big sell-off today on Wall Street. The Dow lost more than 300 points. Earlier, it was down as much as 500. The Nasdaq gave back 280. Tech stocks spurred the losses, including Nvidia, Tesla, and Microsoft. Commuters, meet holiday travelers. Roadways are jammed this Friday with people heading back from afternoon trips. Here's our Rita Foley.
Record-breaking numbers of people expected to be on the move, most by car. The number of Americans on buses, trains, and cruising this holiday season is up nearly 10%. But air travel is expected to shatter its record this holiday season with almost 8 million passengers.
There's a detour for travelers on Interstate 80 in New Jersey, about 45 miles west of New York City. Road crews are working around the clock to repair a giant sinkhole. It developed from an abandoned mine beneath the highway. The White House is expected to propose about $1 billion more in aid for Ukraine, trying to get military supplies to the embattled country before President Biden leaves office. His national security spokesman, John Kirby, says the president is monitoring reports that a Russian defense system may have downed that passenger jet from Azerbaijan.
Made very clear to the Azerbaijani government that we stand ready and willing to help them should they need it with their investigation.
The U.S. Centers for Disease Control says it appears the bird flu virus had mutated in a patient from Louisiana who suffered severe illness. Homelessness spiked in the U.S. this year, up 18%, or some 770,000 people. Many Americans are dreaming of winning the big Mega Millions jackpot tonight.
It's $1 billion, isn't it? That's a big one.
This is AP News. New charges against the man accused of burning a woman to death on a New York City subway last weekend.
Prosecutors say the man accused of burning a sleeping woman to death inside a New York City subway station has been indicted on murder and arson charges.
Murder in the first degree, 3 counts of murder in the second degree, and arson in the first degree.
Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez says if convicted, the suspect, Sebastian Zepeda, could spend the rest of his life in prison without parole. Authorities say during questioning, Zepeda claimed he did not know what happened, but he identified himself in photos and surveillance videos showing the fire being lit. I'm Mike Hempen.
A missing German Shepherd Husky mix who escaped from her Florida home earlier this month is now back home. She showed up on the family's doorstep and she even rang the doorbell. I'm Jackie Quinn, AP News.
This is 8:20 a.m. WCPT Willow Springs and streaming worldwide at WCPT820.com. We are Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Now your WCPT 820 weather update.
I'm meteorologist Ray Miller from the Weatherology Weather Center. Rain continues tonight with areas of fog developing and a low temperature of 46 degrees. South winds at 15 to 30. Saturday, cloudy. Temperatures holding steady in the upper 40s with gusty southwest winds. Sunday, chance of rain and a high of 45 degrees. Monday, partly sunny with high temperatures in the mid-40s. Tuesday, rain likely and a little bit of light snow mixing in with a high temperature around 42 degrees. That's your latest Chicago weather update. Right now, it's 51.
Hey, where's Hal Sparks? I'm not sure where he is now, but I know where you can find him Saturdays at 11. He'll be right here on WCPT 820 for the Hal Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide. WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I am always excited to talk to our next guest, Dr. Philip Barker. Phil is a professor of political science at Keene State College in New Hampshire. He's also my podcast partner on our Podcast to Politics Lab. Many of you have heard Phil before on the show. So welcome back to WCPT, Phil.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Oh, absolutely. We have to talk about Russia. And specifically, I want to talk to you about this Russia's hybrid war that it's been waging. We and others have spent a lot of time thinking about the conflict in Ukraine and the status and the development of that. But, the idea of this hybrid war that's playing out all across Europe, led by Russia, is not getting a ton of attention. So maybe a good place to start is, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what Russia is up to in Europe these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's often news, there's often events in the news talking about Vladimir Putin and Russia, and there's this tendency to take them each as sort of isolated individual incidents. So, people are familiar with the occasional, more occasional than it should be, but occasional assassination of dissidents and whatnot overseas. But especially since the beginning of the Ukraine war, there's been this broadening of Russian sort of unconventional attacks across Europe and elsewhere. So there's been a number of arsons of various Ukrainian-owned enterprises or military contractors. There's been assassination attempts. Vladimir Putin has apparently been. There was an article, I don't know, probably a month or so ago that talked about this. You and I talked about it on the podcast. Has been hunting down Russian exiles, people who have fled Russia in the wake of the Ukraine war. But then, this other things, like just this week, there were warnings a week or two ago about the ways in which Russia is sort of tampering with, interfering with, jamming radar and GPS, things that are necessary for flights. And then just a couple of days ago, there was a Azerbaijan Air flight that crashed, and that most of the fingers are being pointed at Russia for that. But also, the other news story, you and I were texting about this earlier, just in the last couple of days as well, a Russian ship has been seized by Finland because it was seemingly intentionally destroying data cables that ran between, I think, Finland and Estonia, maybe. But this is not the first time this has happened. They've also sabotaged all sorts of energy infrastructure. And so this is becoming, again, any one of these things feels like a provocative attack. But I think this is when we start talking about hybrid war, it's important to realize that this is all a part of a broader systematic attack on certainly on Western Europe, but on allies of Ukraine, countries that have supported Ukraine. I think it fits into the Ukraine-Russia war, but it also fits into this broader sort of animosity that Vladimir Putin has towards the sort of global institutions, the global order that we've been living in.
And this is really interesting because, and I think you talked about this as like a coordinated and systematic, right? It's not simply, because we all hear the stories about, Putin is assassinating some dissident or poisoning somebody. But this is part of a coordinated effort to poke Europe, to cause problems in Europe, right? To spread disinformation, to undermine the democratic process, to intervene in elections, right? It's all part of this broader effort of Russia to basically cause problems and create dissension all across Europe. But each one individual action stays below like a conventional military action. Why? Okay, tell me, why would Putin be doing that?
Why would he be keeping them below that threshold? Yeah, I mean, this fits into a broad. I mean, you can see this pattern. The pattern is probably most visible to casual observers or news junkies. You can see the same sort of approach playing out with Putin's nuclear threats, right?
Yes.
From the beginning, he continues to, or he has continued from the beginning of the Ukraine war to hint at, insinuate that, or sometimes just explicitly say that Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons in response to Western intervention or interference in Ukraine. But what he always seems to be sort of pushing it in a way that it is not enough to justify sort of a preemptive response from the West. It feels like he's kind of feeling out how far he can go. I mean, this is essentially a poker game. He's playing, he's bluffing maybe.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about the stakes being as high as they are, it's how quickly or how willing are you to call him on his bluff, because maybe he's not bluffing. And so I feel like this is a similar sort of thing where he's pushing to see how far he can go. So it's very well documented. People talk about Russia as like a revisionist power, right? Russia, China, there's a number of countries that really want to see change at the international level. Vladimir Putin for many years has been frustrated by sort of Western democracy promotion. He's been threatened by that, and he wants to push back, but he, especially now that he's bogged down in Ukraine, he doesn't want to risk all-out war. So this is this opportunity to push back, to challenge things, to keep some level of plausible deniability, to have all of these sort of offensive, these acts that are degrading kind of Western unity. But he also does it in a way that, if you were to respond to it, it would feel like you're the one overreacting, right? How do you respond to this kind of provocation that is a provocation, but also, it's brilliant on his part. It's terrible, but it's kind of brilliant on his part.
It is. It's sort of downright sneaky, right? I mean, because you do all of these little things that each one of them doesn't feel like it rises to the level that deserves a dramatic response, right? If Putin were to launch a missile into Poland, we know how Poland and how NATO would respond. There's very clear protocols, but as long as he keeps it at these lower levels while maintaining some plausible deniability, right? So this, the cutting of the cables, and that's such a big deal, right? When these Russian ships are out trolling for hundreds of miles and cutting these fiber optic cables and information cables, it has a major impact. But then he can say, like, oh no, that wasn't me. That the ship captain must have just been lost, right? It allows him to pursue sort of sabotage tactics and not have to worry about a more conventional response. So it's very sneaky, and it's got to be really annoying for Europe as well.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, this all fits into the other part, I think, as you were talking, is, Vladimir Putin comes from the KGB, right? I mean, this is like his training is in sort of, you and I, when we talked a little bit about this on the podcast, you talked about how this is a bit like, Cold War, how there was such an emphasis on covert operations because of, the fear of direct confrontation between major superpowers, because, countries wanted plausible deniability. And Putin's KGB background, those fingerprints are all over all of this, right? And it has been, that's nothing new for him. I mean, there's been, whether that is, early invasions before the Ukraine war into Crimea, into Georgia, a lot of his international actions have this kind of, a trait of plausible deniability. Even, lots of sort of, I think, pretty credible allegations that some of the stuff that has happened in Russia have been kind of, red flag type operations and whatnot. This is just kind of how he operates, and it's been effective up to this point.
Absolutely. And what's sort of been so shocking for me is to hear some of these European diplomats talk about this in terms of the language of war, right? So what they're saying is that what Russia is up to is essentially the equivalent of engaging in war against European countries, and we need to start calling these tactics what they really are, right? And I get the hesitation to use that kind of language, but you're seeing this throughout Europe where they're saying, like, hey, you're cutting international cables, you're intervening and trying to undermine our democratic process, you're assassinating individuals, you're starting fires, right? All of these things are acts of war, and we need to be more clear in using language as explaining it as such, right? It's a provocation.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, when you think about this, it's that quote. It just sort of reminds me, when countries go to war, they do this sort of stuff in addition, right? The sabotage, the attacking of communication lines, the targeting of the military, sort of industrial infrastructure. This is all the sort of stuff that you do when you're at war, and it's like Russia has skipped the actual direct conflict stuff and has gone straight to all the sort of sabotage elements of it. But yeah, I mean, you can see that the Western Europe in particular, who, that has struggled with some level of unity over the past kind of 15 years or whatever. And the U.S. has really had a hard time responding to it. And I think that quote you read is a really important quote because I think that's kind of gets at the heart of this, which is we have to stop thinking of this as isolated, harassing incidents. And we have to start thinking about it as part of this bigger campaign. It doesn't look like war as we've seen it in the past. But as we move into this new world that we are in with, especially as we start talking about the addition of, our artificial intelligence and all sorts of other stuff, I feel like this sort of thing is going to become increasingly common, and it doesn't feel like we really know how to respond to it at this point.
Ooh, this is really interesting. We got to take a quick break, but when we come back, Phil, I'm going to ask you about how we respond to this, right? And how the international community and Europe as a whole thinks about this. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back on WCPT.
WCPT Replay.
With us this morning is professor, author, and human resources management consultant Dante King.
Donald Trump represents everything that America values and stands for. It's a culture that is rooted and functions upon a foundation of narcissism. It does. And I think that we all, to a degree, are socialized with that. And I think when we look at someone like a Donald Trump, he represents the narcissism to its fullest extreme. He represents the celebrity that we value. He represents the economics of the equation. That's something that we're taught to strive for and see that we value highly. He represents the whiteness, the maleness. And I just think we have to take an inventory of that and what our standards and values really are as a society.
Keep listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
This is WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are talking with Dr. Phil Barker, who's a professor of political science at Keene State College, and we're talking about Russia and this hybrid war that Russia is waging across Europe. Very, very distinct from the more conventional war that they're carrying out in Ukraine. As we went to break, we were talking about how Europe and how the international community can respond. So, Phil, let's start thinking through how does the international community, how do European states recognize or acknowledge that war is shifting? What do these responses look like, or how do we start to think about this new world that we're entering?
It's a good question, and I don't know that I feel like this is the challenge that much of the world has, which is because it's new, because it's novel. We don't have necessarily great answers. And this is, I think it's worth pointing out, this is the danger of these sorts of situations we talk about in political science, right? Anytime you have, I mean, even if all the actors are sort of rational and self-interested and all of that, mistakes happen. And this is a perfect example of where I think Putin might be pushing, never intending for it to, drift into actual direct conflict. But, how do you respond? This is where, if the West doesn't respond strongly enough and Russia pushes too far, that could actually provoke war. Or if the West pushes back in a way that Russia perceives as too provocative, that could lead to actual war. So it's a really dangerous and delicate moment, I think. But I also think there has to be a response. I think this is, what we were talking about right before the break, which is the first step is to think of this as a systematic, sort of unified strategic approach, right? This is not Vladimir Putin just being a turd, right? This is Vladimir Putin actually carrying out a strategy. And so there has to be some sort of, response to what he's doing, something stronger than what we've been doing. What we've seen is the sort of limited level of sanctions hasn't really done it. So you could ramp that up. You could increase sanctions. You could push back. This is going to be the challenge with, you and I have also talked about like cyber warfare, some of these other things that are coming along because they're kind of new. There's not this sort of established norm of what is acceptable in terms of what you can do, but also what's acceptable in terms of a response. And so it's important to be cautious. But I think right now the West is maybe being too cautious in how they respond. It feels like bullying behavior, and at some point, like appeasement has to shift to something else to push back against the bullying behavior. That's downplaying it to call it bullying. I mean, we're talking about violations of international law, but I think the analogy is kind of a useful one.
No, 100%, right? Because if Europe, and actually the other states that Russia is targeting, if they do nothing, it really is, you use that term appeasement. It just encourages Russia to continue the behavior. And again, there's a goal behind this. I mean, Russia is hoping to destabilize Europe economically, politically. He's hoping to shatter NATO, right? So all of these actions have consequences. So you have to respond. But as you noted, like the nature of that response is unclear because you can't respond militarily, right? Because that's an escalation. You don't really want to respond in kind because the tactics that Putin is using are so unethical, right? You don't want to respond by using targeted assassinations. You don't want to keep cutting, cables and all of this. So it puts Europe in a really, really difficult position. But as you noted, this is where war is shifting. And so the international community and states are going to start to have to grapple with how do you respond to this more unconventional war? Because cyber war isn't going away, especially, and in particular with somebody like Putin who doesn't care about stability. Russia is very different from China. Like China engages in some behavior, but they really want the system as a whole to be preserved because they're benefiting from that system. Putin doesn't have those same motivations. He wouldn't mind to see it all burn, right? So it becomes really, really challenging. You can put more sanctions on Russia, but I still don't know what form those responses take. But I totally agree with you that there has to be some type of response.
Yeah, you and I have talked in the past. I think there's another analogy that I think is useful. You were talking about Russia wants to see it burn. And it's a little bit like Trumpian politics in general in the U.S., right? Where Trump is wanting to sort of shatter norms and change how American politics works. And part of the challenge in dealing with that is that the Democratic Party and more moderate sort of anti-Trump Republicans are trying to uphold the old norms, the old kind of collegiality, the old sort of form of politics. And so Trump is able to sort of abandon those because he doesn't care about them. He wants them to go away. And so if you're trying to uphold those old norms, how do you push back against someone like Trump without sort of contributing to the undermining of these older norms of good politics of loyal opposition and all of that? And this is a similar challenge where the West, where NATO, the European Union, the United States, its allies want to push back against Putin, but there's a disadvantage here because Putin is unbound or is sort of uncaring about international norms and the international laws that deal with this sort of stuff. And the West has to push back against that, but in a way that doesn't further erode those kind of values that they're trying to protect. And that's a hard place to operate from.
That's really thoughtful, right? That, you've got standards that you want to uphold, but you're fighting somebody who openly rejects those standards. And as you were talking, it made me think about this transition. Russia really has become a pariah state. After the invasion of Ukraine, they strike me as more similar to North Korea than other states, right? I mean, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of another state North Korea is also equally problematic in the international system. But I'm trying to think is somebody else who's as obnoxious internationally as Russia. I think there's a lot of similarities between Russia and North Korea, and now North Korea is sending Russia troops. Like maybe Iran, right? We can think about that axis of troublemakers.
Yeah, I mean, Iran's the only, when you were talking, Iran was the only other one I could think of. Again, supporting, again, that sort of plausible deniability of supporting these proxy groups that are, trying to essentially be both, literal, but also figurative bomb throwers in the sort of political and economic systems of other countries. But yeah, I mean, if the two countries that you can think of as sort of similar are Iran and North Korea,
right?
It's hard not to argue that Russia has really kind of become this pariah state. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you how do you think that? So I have some thoughts on how to respond, but I like more concrete thoughts, I guess. But what do you think about like how NATO or how the U.S. should push back against this sort of international bullying or these this hybrid war tactic?
I think unfortunately, I think it requires states to not necessarily get their hands dirty, but they have to be forceful in that response, right? It's not enough. I think there are two stages. One, you have to do what Europe is doing right now, which is call it out. I mean, you have to say what they're doing is war. It's provocative. If it continues, there are going to be responses, and then articulate what those responses are. I think they need to be more than sanctions, right? I mean, because I don't know if you can put another sanction on Russia. They're essentially cut off from the Western world right now in terms of the economics. But I think they probably have to be. You're probably looking at cyber. You're probably looking at, internet actions. I mean, I think there has to be a lot of things that would raise the cost to Putin, and to do so in a way that may not be public. But I will say I feel somewhat uncomfortable advising that because we saw that through the Cold War, and it quickly drifts into unethical behavior. So I don't know. It's an uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing I think of is, when we using the analogy of, I don't know, Trumpian politics in the U.S., or you and I have talked a lot about like sort of ethics in war and how do you push back against somebody who's violating, moral boundaries in warfare without sort of abandoning those values yourself. And I come back around to, so if the Democrats are trying to uphold some of the norms of American politics against Donald Trump, like you don't have to hold yourself, strongly to those norms. You can respond to norm violations with norm violations yourself, but you do so with like also communicating your intention, right? You are so if Trump or if the Republicans are gonna do something, stack the Supreme Court, then maybe the Democrats add judges, but they basically do so while saying, hey, we're doing this because you have abandoned the old rules of judicial appointments. And if you're willing to go back to the old way, we are as well. And it feels like that. I think about how that applies here. And I think it applies in a sense of, the Western response to some of these provocations by Russia. It seems like need to be limited and specific. So what does that mean? It means like there needs to be, so in this particular instance, if it is established that Russia was in fact this Finnish, this ship that was seized in Finland that actually was destroying these underwater data cables. If that's the case, then the West needs a more forceful and clear response. But it has to be, when I say limited and specific, you say, hey, this is, Russia has destroyed this data infrastructure, and so we're going to, sabotage some sort of communications or data type thing in Russia. And you say, hey, we've done that, and we did it in response to this particular act, and we're not going to do more unless you also do more, right? And so I think the importance is the audience is not just Russia. You're trying to send a message to Russia. We're not going to stand by while you do this stuff. But the audience is also the broader world. You don't want to contribute to Russia's narrative that the West or the U.S. is essentially an aggressive bully, right? And so what you do is you basically say, yeah, we're going to do this thing, but that's our intention. We're going to do that and stop there. And as long as you don't sort of continue destroying or attacking our infrastructure, we'll leave yours alone as well. And so then you're upholding these kind of boundaries, but you're doing it in a forceful and clear way. I realize that's sort of simpler than it, it's easier said than done, but it feels like there has to be some sort of response, but there has to be clear communication and expectations tied to those responses as well.
Well, I like your approach much better because the idea is that you can do so, but uphold the norms, right? So part of the battle between the United States, Russia, and China right now is who gets to define the future of the international system. And there's real value to say that there should be, you want to root for somebody who's got some real soft power, who's doing it the right ways. This is interesting. All right, Phil, we got to take another break. When we come back, I want to pick Phil's brain about Trump's imperialism, wanting to take control of the Panama Canal, Greenland, and Canada. So we will be right back on WCPT.
Have you heard? Affordable healthcare is better than ever. And right now there are more carriers and plans to choose from. If you're between 18 and 64 years old with a household income of $25,000 or less, this message is for you. Right now the government's Affordable Care Act is available for individual and family health coverage plans with little or no cost to you. Don't gamble with your health. Call Healthcare for All at 800-264-0899. That's 800-264-0899.
I'm Peter Schacknow, CNBC. Santa Claus hit a speed bump on the way to his traditional Wall Street rally with a sizable sell-off ending the holiday-shortened trading week. The Dow fell 334 points to close at 42,992. The S&P 500 slid 1.1%. The Nasdaq tumbled 1.5%. If you're looking for a bright spot, the major averages did still finish higher for the week. An appeals court has rejected an appeal by coffee chain Starbucks of an NLRB ruling that two baristas were fired because they wanted to start a union. But the judge did say the NLRB exceeded its authority by ordering Starbucks to pay any expenses for the baristas stemming from their being fired. Vaccine maker BioNTech has settled separate royalty underpayment cases with the National Institutes of Health and the University of Pennsylvania. It will pay $792 million to the NIH and $467 million to the university. Pfizer, which partnered with BioNTech on the COVID vaccine, will reimburse part of those payments. Peter Schacknow, CNBC.
Hear the CNBC business updates each weekday at 9:30, 12:30, and 4:30. Now, your WCPT 820 Chicago weather update.
I'm meteorologist Ray Miller from the Weatherology Weather Center. Rain continues tonight with areas of fog developing and a low temperature of 46 degrees. South winds at 15 to 30. Saturday, cloudy. Temperatures holding steady in the upper 40s with gusty southwest winds. Sunday, chance of rain and a high of 45 degrees. Monday, partly sunny with high temperatures in the mid-40s. Tuesday, rain likely and a little bit of light snow mixing in with a high temperature around 42 degrees. That's your latest Chicago weather update. Right now, it's 51.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are talking with Dr. Phil Barker, who's a professor of political science at Keene State College. I just want to remind everybody that for listening live to Joan's podcast, you can listen live weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. at 8:20 a.m. or on TuneIn from the Heartland.com signal, or tell Alexa to play WCPT from TuneIn. So there's a lot of ways to stay connected. All right, Phil, I have been struggling to wrap my head around the stupidity of what Trump is up to, talking about taking the Panama Canal, Greenland, and Canada. So I need to pick your brain and get your thoughts on what's going on here. What is the motivation? When you heard this, what was going through your head as all of these things were coming out over the last couple of days?
I mean, my first thought was I can't believe we're back on the Greenland thing. But,
right.
I mean, this will be an interesting. This is kind of an interesting test or preview of what his second term will be like, because I think we've talked a lot about how in the first term of Trump term, he was surrounded by lots of, I think, smart professionals who kind of reined him in or talked him down from stuff. And we're not going to have that this time around. And so it feels like the Greenland thing is back. And it will play out, I imagine, somewhat differently than it did last time. And so it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, I mean, it's the first thing is, Trump has been, it kind of reveals to me to some extent the lack of any real kind of Trump global view, any sort of Trumpian doctrine, right? Because he campaigned so much early on being, in his first term about, getting America out of wars, that it's easy to sort of look at him and see him as an isolationist, as someone who, certainly in terms of economics, right, this kind of trade war approach to things, and yet he's coming out of the gate with this desire to reclaim the Panama Canal, to again acquire Greenland for the United States, and so there's this element of kind of American interventionism, neo-imperialism to it, and which is also sort of interesting. I mean, when you hear it, I'm kind of interested, because you and I haven't talked about this. I'm interested to hear what you think about it. I have theories about what's going on, but what's your, on a surface level at least, what do you see playing out here?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying it feels very much like we've been thrown back into the 19th century. Like, these were the kind of conversations and debates that occurred at that point, right? When the United States was invading Latin America and Mexico. And I mean, we engaged in very imperialistic military behavior, but then once we got into the early 1900s, we sort of revisited this, and Hoover and others start to have conversations to say, maybe we shouldn't be the Colossus to the north, and maybe we shouldn't constantly be intervening, and so there was a shift away from it. So I'm just stunned by the way Trump can find these obscure arguments and go back to them, because you and I study U.S. foreign policy, we study international politics, we pay attention to all these things. Nobody, no serious, person who's studying international politics is making the argument that the United States needs to take the Panama Canal back, or Greenland, or that Canada should become the 51st state, right? Nobody is making those arguments other than Trump. And I mean, that's not to say that Greenland doesn't have valuable resources, but they're not for sale, right? So there's sort of a stupidity to all of this. I honestly, I don't know. I don't know if this is something that, if somebody has his ear and is saying we're getting screwed over by, Panama, it could be something personal. You hear allegations that, Trump has been charged taxes in Panama with businesses and he's had some problems there. It could be as simple as that he's mad at Panama because they charged him something. But the Greenland one is really bizarre because it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. I don't know. You sometimes have a better pulse on this than me. What do you think is motivating him here?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, because I mean, it really is, as you were talking, this feels like, American foreign policy being carried out by someone whose only experience with foreign policy is like the game of Risk, right? Where it feels like controlling more territory means you're winning. And there may be some truth to that. I mean, I think Trump's worldview is fairly simplistic, right? I mean, it's this very us versus them, and if somebody wins and somebody loses in every engagement, right? Every encounter. It's not a world in which, by working together, we can all win.
Yeah.
Right? This is Trump. So I think that's part of it. But I mean, ultimately, I think if you want to understand what Trump is doing, again, I think we spent many years trying to, filter through and decide whether or not, is there a strategy here? Is this just random? And I think, to come back around to it, the simplest explanation or the best way to understand most of Trump's behavior is just, it's not neo-imperialism, it's narcissistic bullying, right? I mean, it is about him. So, I mean, you start with the Canada stuff, right? Where he has, suggested that Canada become the 51st state and referred to Trudeau as the governor of Canada.
Multiple times.
Right. I don't think that's anything other than, a narcissist ego, this chance that he sees Trump sees that he has an advantage or a leg up or whatever in this particular situation, and he's just going to humiliate Trudeau in Canada. There's no long-term, what does this mean for American relations with Canada? That just doesn't play into his head. And so, I think some of it is that, it's this idea he was mocked for with Greenland. Maybe it's just I'm going to show people. It comes back around to it's not, there's no big grand strategy. It is somebody planted a seed in his head and he's thinking about Greenland or he's thinking about Panama, and not in any sort of large scale way. It could be that it's him personal, or it could be some, like you said, a random person who told a story about, somebody was complaining about the end of the treaty that gave America control of the Panama Canal, and now he's stuck on that. Right. And so I think that's like, it has to be the simplest understanding, or the simplest approach. But it is also like, it is foreign policy based entirely on like hard power. It's not the idea of like relations or trade, or that, global trade is good and it benefits America in the long term, even if in indirect ways. That's all out the window. Like, Trump has this very simple sort of black and white, right? We have to win. If we're powerful, it means we can do what we want. And it feels like that's what's running through this. And again, that might, I don't know, in the short term might have some advantages, I guess. But in the long term, it just feels like it's going to be disastrous for American leadership worldwide, and for just, America's position in the world.
Well, I think that's such an important point there, right? That there are costs to this. It would be one thing if Trump was just, talking about the Panama Canal or Canada or Greenland, but these are real states with real interests who generally, especially Canada, who has historically cooperated with the United States. I mean, Canada has been a long-term partner for the United States, and, one of the states that sent troops in to fight in Afghanistan. I mean, they have skin in the game for the United States. So to just intentionally antagonize them is sort of, as you noted, bullying, but it's also disrespectful to another state. And again, I'm not saying that the United States shouldn't be disrespectful just for the purpose. I mean, because it's the right thing to do. But there will be costs, economically, security costs, for behaving in this way. Same thing. Panama's a smaller actor, but there are times when you need the world community to support you, and when you just sort of actively relish in upsetting your closest allies, it's short-sighted, because there is going to be a time when you're going to need them, and they may be less inclined to support you because of this behavior.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to, again, there's also this pattern of, as you were talking about, the focus on these are allies, right? These are some of our best allies. It's Canada, it's Denmark, who controls Greenland, right? So that fits into the other part I thought of as you were talking through that, is it fits into this broader kind of affinity that Trump has for authoritarians, right? Like, he's picking on, democracies and allies. He's not picking on authoritarians. And that, I think, says something about his view of politics. But it also is back to this kind of narcissistic bullying. It's also it's acceptable, right? It's sort of low risk. Like, Canada is going to take it in some way. They'll sort of laugh it off or dismiss him or whatever, but nothing really serious. He's not saying that we're going to be that we should be taking territory from China or North Korea. And I don't know if that's because of affinity for those places, or if it's because doing that sort of thing has real inherent risks that he recognizes. And so this is like, I don't know, sort of a safe bullying that he can do. He can sort of push these things. And again, Denmark's not going to start a war with the United States over American, aspirations for Greenland.
Sure.
China, North Korea, Iran would respond differently if we started openly stating that we wanted some of their territory.
Well, absolutely, right. And you think about, as we think about the real threats, in the previous segment, we were talking about Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. These are real threats that are trying to push back against the system, the global system that the United States has created. And so you want to have as many allies on your side speaking with one voice. And when you're going around and trying to break up alliances and disrespect, close allies, it makes your job that much more difficult. And in some ways, I have to think China and Russia are very excited about Trump's behavior and the instability and the chaos it's causing, because it makes their job a little bit easier in terms of undermining this system. It strikes me in so many different ways as problematic.
Yeah, I mean, this fits in perfect. It's not just that I think Russia is happy about it. This is a very kind of Russian. I mean, Russia and China have complained about notions of sovereignty, and that if neighboring countries, if Russian or Chinese interests, have some sort of impact or play in neighboring countries, then they have a right to intervene, and that's very much what Trump is doing, right? Yeah. It's the same sort of approach that, if we need Greenland, if we need Panama, Panama Canal, then we have a right to, impose our will on them.
Sure.
And so it's a very, again, kind of hard power Russia-China approach. Now, I know that I don't know how much time we have left in the segment, but one of the interesting things I think about through all of this is there was this really fascinating article at the end of the first Trump administration that basically argued that the only thing different about Trump's foreign policy was that he sort of said out loud the unsayable things. And that's the other part I think about. Like, if you really wanted to be sort of critical, and maybe there's people at home listening who are saying, well, this is nothing new about America imposing its will in Latin America or on Greenland or belittling allies. Like, we've done this forever. It's just that in the past, we would do it, like we've talked about, covertly, or we would do it, but still sort of praise the Western institutions, and Trump has sort of abandoned all of that. So is that difference significant? Does that matter that at least that in the past, even if we were hypocritical about it, we still praised Western institutions and values?
It's a great point. No, I mean, I think some of the research that I've done is looking at covert interventions during the Cold War, and the United States toppled all sorts of democracies, right? Yeah. While it was arguing that it was upholding democracy. You raise a really important question. At least by doing the bad stuff quietly, you're preserving that norm. I mean, hypocritically, right? We can be honest here. Like, the United States doesn't always adhere to the very norms that it suggests, but at least you're trying to preserve the norm. So I would say it's better, but it's also problematic. But I think Trump's is sort of the worst, because you're engaging in the bad behavior and smashing the norm at the same time. And I think there is value, even if it's hypocritical, to saying, these norms that we profess really, really matter. But this is an interesting point. What do you think about that?
I think it matters. I mean, I think the ideal situation is a world in which the U.S. promotes these norms and also abides by them.
Yes.
But I think upholding the norms and then but violating them, but doing so in a way that indicates that the norms still matter, or that you are in some way embarrassed of you recognize that doing it in the open is problematic, is still better than just abandoning them altogether, right? This is, if someone's violating the law, but they're doing it sort of, quietly or secretly, it indicates that they recognize that the law, applies to them. If someone just doesn't care at all about the law, that's in fact actually quite a bit scarier than someone who at least feels the need to be restrained in some way. And so, I think it does matter that Trump is just saying the quiet thing, out loud. This is the article that I was mentioning, talks about it as the norm of not noticing. Right? In the past, we had all of these problematic aspects of our foreign policy, but it was expected that you didn't speak about it. You just didn't notice it. And I think that's bad, but it's better than a world in which those norms just don't apply at all.
Ideally, you would want to live your values, right? And I think there's an argument to be made that the United States in this current world system should try to live its values, because there's real benefits and again, long-term strategic interest in doing so. But short of that, at least lie about it, right? So
right.
The other thing is that when Trump does this, it sort of normalizes, when his Panama and Canada, it normalizes that behavior. And I've been struck by how odd it is to be reading pieces in the news about what Greenland's value is, and should the United States take the Panama Canal back, right? It legitimizes really, really dangerous conversations. But this is really fascinating. Well, we are up against the break here. Phil, thank you so much for joining us. Again, we've been talking with Dr. Phil Barker, who's a professor of political science at Keene State College. Phil, thanks so much for joining. It's always fun to get your perspective.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and the family as well. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back on WCPT.
This is a WCPT Moment in Labor. In 2011, 6 Jimmy John's employees in Minneapolis were fired by their franchise-owning company, Mickey Lynn Enterprises, after fighting for paid sick days. This is a common theme in the union-free world of fast food. Over 13 million Americans work in the fast food industry, making an average of $13,500 a year, not even half the average cost of living. 80% of fast food workers have experienced work-related injuries, and only 13% were covered by their employer. A group of employees referred to as the Jimmy John's Six fought for these rights, creating an online campaign, posting a picture of 2 sandwiches saying one of these was made by a healthy employee, the other was made by a sick employee. Can you tell the difference? Too bad, as Jimmy John's workers do not get paid sick days. Help workers win sick days. More than 32 million Americans work a job that does not offer paid sick days. This has been a WCPT Moment in Labor. We're working for your rights.
You know, as they say, one person's personal information is another person's treasure.
That's why I don't go online without connecting to NordVPN. I don't want anyone stealing my personal information and snooping on my browsing activity. Also, TechRadar named NordVPN as the most trusted VPN by casual users and experts. Features like Threat Protection Pro safeguard your devices from phishing websites, scan downloads for malicious files, and disable intrusive ads and trackers so you can surf more safely online. Just check NordVPN.com, grab the deal, and see for yourself. By the way, you can protect up to 10 devices with one account. NordVPN. Cybersecurity built for every day.
You're listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We've had some really, really interesting conversations today. I had a couple things that I wanted to share with you, but before I do that, just want to remind everybody that Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, now has its very own podcast. Two, actually. Joan Esposito full episodes and Joan Esposito featured interviews. You can subscribe to one or both. I recommend both. The podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Amazon. Just search for Joan Esposito or get the links on Joan's page by visiting theheartlandsignal.com and clicking on her picture. The full episodes feed will include this show and also the show on Monday I was on. So if you want to hear more from me, those are also listed as well. Wonderful way to stay connected. Podcasts are just a wonderful way to sort of keep connected with political conversation. So a couple things I just wanted to talk about before we wrap up today. And one is this issue of, is the country ready for a woman president? And there was a really fascinating article in the Washington Post a couple days ago talking about this and specifically asking Bill Clinton and Senator Lindsey Graham. So, you know, Bill Clinton and Lindsey Graham don't agree on much, yet recently these sort of ideological adversaries found some common ground on the political question of whether the country is ready for a woman president. They agree that a woman can win the White House, but she's probably going to be a conservative. And I think this is an interesting question to sort of think about. So Graham was quoted. Graham says, are there women out there, governors, a Republican, Democrat, that can be the next president of the United States? Absolutely, Mr. Graham said in an interview on the Capitol Hill this month. Quote, if you have a Republican female nominee, they would have a good shot of being the first woman president. Interesting argument. All right, so but Bill Clinton also echoed those same arguments. Bill Clinton said, quote, ideologically, the people who are most likely to be against women are most likely to be conservative. So when people agree with you, it's easier to be for them, he said. But I think a woman can be elected president. I do. So this is a really interesting question, right? I've been thinking about it the last couple days, especially in the aftermath of Kamala Harris losing the election. And I will say this, you know, political scientists study elections and the causes for why certain candidates win and others lose. And they have looked back, and there's a lot of really, really compelling research looking at the 2016 presidential election, and it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton, being a woman, was a major factor in her defeat. It wasn't the only factor, but it was one of them. And to be honest, we do not have that sort of data yet on the latest presidential election, but I think it's fair to say that there were a multitude of factors that led to Harris's loss, but being a woman, and specifically being a woman of color, is certainly likely to emerge as a factor here. I think there's a lot of things going on there, especially sort of the anti-incumbent wave. But this question about if there is going to be a woman elected president of the United States, is it more likely that they are conservative? And I would tend to think not. Sort of troubles me that that's where we're at, that we have to start in that direction. But I think there may be some truth to that as well. You know, I think back to, you know, if we think back to previous presidents who engaged in difficult decisions, it was oftentimes the Republican who was able to do that because they had that support. And I guess I do think there's some validity here that the country needs to continue to push for getting women in politics, electing more women. One thing, the data is very clear. If more women run, more women are elected. So if you're thinking about Democrats and Republicans, one of the goals should be to get more women running for office. You get more women running for office, those women will win those offices. And at a macro level, I think it's important that you not get discouraged by this last presidential election and think about, the United States was very, very, very close to electing a woman. And had it not been for a bad economy, I think they might have. So I think that's a really, really interesting question to think about. The other thing I've been grappling with lately is the legacy of Joe Biden. He's got a few weeks left in office, and I think a lot about Joe Biden's legacy. And much of the attention has shifted to the new incoming Trump administration, the new shiny objects. And that shouldn't surprise us, right? This is what happens. But I think it also offers an opportunity for a reflection on Joe Biden. And his legacy is no doubt caught up in the election of Donald Trump. Had Kamala Harris won, we'd be having a very, very different conversation. He would be the president who stepped away to allow for historic change. The election of the first woman of color, that would have been transformative, but it didn't happen. And it therefore complicates how we assess Biden because he was involved in that process. Now, apparently, part of the reason I bring this up is behind the scenes, Biden has been reflective of the moment and expressed some frustrations and regrets, which isn't surprising. You lose a presidential election, there's a lot of internal thinking. He's voiced regrets about his decision not to sign his name to the COVID relief checks, which I think is sort of silly because that's what Donald Trump did, and oftentimes that leads to success, and he thinks that maybe if he'd signed his name to some of those checks, he might have done well. He also apparently has been reflecting on his longtime reputation of being the poorest lawmaker in Congress. He once saw that as a sign of virtue, that he wasn't somebody who had to be a billionaire, who had to be rich. He apparently now sees that as having been a burden. And that maybe this is where our democracy is moving, is that money is likely to derive success. So I do tend to think that Biden will likely be remembered like other one-term presidents. In particular, I've been thinking about some interesting parallels to Johnson, LBJ, or George H.W. Bush, Bush 1. Like Biden, those presidents were less flashy than their predecessor. For LBJ, it was Kennedy. For Bush 1, it was Reagan. And for Biden, you could argue it was Obama. Each of them were the less flashy, more focused on the process of governance, right? And that's really what Joe Biden was doing, is he was really thinking about governing. The TV didn't love them the same way that they loved Kennedy, Reagan, or Obama. And it also raises the question of whether presidents like Biden, LBJ, and Bush 1 are likely to get elected in our current environment. And again, I think Biden's legacy is a complicated one, and it won't be settled for years, but I do think there's a lot of validity and value in his presidency. And if we step back, Biden has a lot to be proud of. If we think about, the vaccine shots that he got into people's arms, the largest infrastructure program since the 1950s, the CHIPS and the Science Act, expanding health care, reviving the Cancer Moonshot program, Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, when you look at the legislation that Biden was able to enact, I think it will stand up well. And maybe in the moment, we won't remember that. But as time goes by, I do think that his legacy might expand. He enacted the most significant gun control legislation in decades. He expanded NATO, rallied the world to stop Vladimir Putin. These things are really, really important. And quite often, the immediate judgment of voters isn't the same one as history. In the past, I've talked about Truman and Eisenhower. When they left office, they had low approval ratings. Nobody really liked them, but history judged those presidencies differently. And I do think as time goes by, we might remember Biden better once we get a little bit more removed. I think his approach, his accomplishments, more importantly, his willingness to put love of country above his own political ambitions. I think those are really, really important things, and they're things that we should be valuing in a president. earlier, one time when I was on the show before, I read a quote from Bob Woodward in one of his books talking about Joe Biden. And I was thinking about this again as I came on the show today. And he ends his book talking about, what the Biden presidency revealed to him. And he says of Biden, as this book shows, there were failures and mistakes. The full story is, of course, yet not known. Biden's legacy isn't known. But based on evidence available now, I believe President Biden and his team will largely be cited in history as an example of steady and purposeful leadership. So as I think about the ending of one presidency and the incoming Trump administration, I do think that we will look back and remember the Biden presidency as one that was actually good governance. And I hope that as we move forward the next 4 years that we'll see some good governance as well. But I do worry about that. So, all right, well, my time is up. Thank you again, Joan, for allowing me to guest host. It's been a wonderful opportunity. I so enjoy dealing with everybody here. And I hope everybody has a wonderful and safe holidays. And I'll see you again sometime in the future.
Tonight on Democracy Now!
As Palestinians mourn 5 journalists killed in an Israeli strike near a Gaza hospital, an event clearly marked press. Then President-elect Trump says he wants to make America greater, as in larger. We'll speak with a member of the Danish parliament from Greenland about Trump's vow to buy Greenland.
All those stories and more tonight at 10 on WCPT 820.
This is a WCPT Veteran Minute. In the midst of World War II, a group of Native American soldiers known as the Code Talkers became silent heroes. The U.S. military faced challenge of secure communications on the battlefield, and these men, primarily from the Navajo tribe, were enlisted to develop an unbreakable code. Using their native language, which had no written alphabet, they transmitted vital messages that were indecipherable to enemy forces. The code proved to be an essential asset, particularly in the Pacific Theater, where it helped the Allies win crucial battles. The Code Talkers' courage and ingenuity saved countless lives and turned the tide of the war. Yet, their contributions remained largely unknown until decades later. The legacy of the Code Talkers stands as a testament to the strength, resilience,